Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayubid State. Start of Chapter 5, Part 1. Economic reforms and types of expenditure. Salahuddin's state enjoyed abundance and easy living because its sources of income were many and various. We may list these sources as follows. The vast treasures of the Fatimids available to him after Egypt came under his control. Income from the tax that came from non-Muslims. Ransoms paid by prisoners. Income from booty acquired through war. Income from land tax, which was taken from the inhabitants of lands conquered peacefully. In addition, there were other Islamically acceptable sources of income and other permissible sources of wealth. Salahuddin was not one of those sultans who spent wealth inappropriately. Rather, he spent it for the sake of Allah, building fortresses and citadels and other construction projects that benefited the state. His interest in agriculture and trade. In order to spare the land the woes of famine that could be caused by war, Salahuddin paid a great deal of attention to agriculture and irrigation so that the land could yield its best and offer all types of produce. Egypt and Greater Syria cooperated in an exchange of agricultural produce, reinforcing and strengthening the economy and supplying the army with necessary wealth. The two provinces stood side by side to confront the treacherous aggression of the Franks and to supply the Muslim army with everything it needed of food and weaponry. Salahuddin also paid a great deal of attention to trade. Egypt during his era was the link between East and West, and many European cities flourished because of this trade, such as the Italian cities of Venice and Pisa. Later on, the Venetians were permitted to establish a market in Alexandria. Salahuddin took a great interest in markets and paid attention to them so that the economy could flourish and productivity in his state could increase. He increased the number of markets in Egypt and Syria and paid attention to refurbishing and expanding them. The traveler Ibn Jubair visited some of these markets on his journey during the time of Salahuddin in 578 Hijri, and he recorded his admiration for their system. He said, speaking of the city of Aleppo, "As for the town, it is massively built and wonderfully disposed, and of rare beauty, with large markets arranged in long adjacent rows, so that you pass from a row of shops of one craft into that of another, until you have gone through all the urban industries. These markets are all roofed with wood, so that their occupants enjoy an ample shade, and all hold the gaze from their beauty, and halt in wonder those who are hurrying by. Most of the shops are in wooden warehouses of excellent workmanship." In his book Safarnama, Nasir Khusro described the city of Tripoli in Lebanon at the time of Salahuddin. It is a beautiful city, surrounded by farms and gardens, with a lot of sugar cane, orange, banana, and lemon tree, and hostelries with 4 or 5 or 6 stories. Its streets and markets are clean and beautiful, and you would think that every market is a beautiful palace. In the middle of the city there is a great congregational mosque, well kept and finely adorned, and solidly constructed. In the courtyard of the mosque there is a large dome, beneath which there is a marble cistern, with water coming out of a copper faucet, and in the marketplace there is a water fountain with 5 taps, from which a lot of water comes out, and the people take whatever they need. His interest in manufacturing. Salahuddin paid attention to the manufacture of weapons, textiles, fabrics, embroidered silk, finely crafted horse saddles, and glass. During his era, the manufacture of pottery, ships, fleets, and other things helped the economy to flourish, increased productivity, and gave extra strength to the state. Craftsmen and artisans during the Ayubid era were among the most loyal to their inherited traditions. Groups of workers and craftsmen continued to follow the same systems and methods of manufacturing as had been used in previous era. The artisans were organized in guilds which protected their rights and supervised the execution of their duties in the most complete way. They had their guilds and traditions which everyone respected and which were supported by the state. One of the traditions of these guilds was keeping the secrets of that craft or trade and limiting it to the guild members and their families. Perhaps this explains the widespread phenomena of certain families specializing in a particular craft that was handed down from father to son, in addition to the difficulty for strangers to enter their ranks. Among the most famous centers of manufacturing during the Ayubid era were the following. Cairo. The purpose behind the building of Cairo was not so that it could be the capital of the state or a homeland for every resident of Egypt. Rather, it was intended to be a place of residence solely for the Caliph and his harem, troops, and inner circle, far away from the city of Fustad and its environs. After just 1 century at most, Cairo became an important city in which a society was soon established with all its classes and requirements, and all kinds of crafts and manufacturing spread throughout the city. These activities flourished through the Ayubid era. It is clear that the markets of Cairo flourished during the era of An-Nasr Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, when the city was exposed to economic and social changes, which resulted in increased demand for market products in general. These developments also led to most of the changes that took place in the city's markets during that period. Among the most prominent of these changes was the development of specialization in the markets. For every type of product, there was a market that specialized in it. This was an organizational method that began to be adopted at the time of Salahuddin, when it may be noted that most of the main markets that appeared during the Ayubid era specialized in selling one type of good product. This phenomena was unknown before the Ayubid era. For example, there were markets where only sewn clothes, furniture, and so on were sold. The great Souk al-Jamaloon was founded at the time of Salahuddin. This market specialized in selling silk cloth. Other markets specialized in selling bridal trousseaux and bracelets. A market also appeared between the two palaces, selling weapons, bows, arrows, knives, and other kinds of weapons that soldiers needed. Other markets, such as Asharabashiyin and Al-Khawayisiyin appeared, which sold military uniforms and clothing, as well as the cloaks which the Sultan gave to emirs, viziers, and judges. Some of the markets and crafts were moved from Fustat to Cairo. This phenomena was something natural, because it became permitted for the masses and ordinary people to live in Cairo at the time of Salahuddin. A number of merchants and craftsmen found the opportunity to move to Cairo in order to practice their trades there, near the officials and emirs of the state, after the state dismantled the craftsman system that had existed during the Fatimid era. This led to a large number of craftsmen moving to the various markets to work there. This undoubtedly contributed to the increase and development of manufacturing activity in Cairo, which in turn contributed to the flourishing of trade based on manufacturing at the time of An-Nasir Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Fustad. It may be said that the fire which started by Shawar in 564 Hijri almost destroyed Fustad completely, were it not for the Ayyubids' efforts to save it. From the time Asad ad-Din Shirkuh became vizier, he showed an interest in rebuilding it. Then this mission was continued after his death by his nephew Salah ad-Din, who paid a great deal of attention to Fustad, renovating its mosques and principal buildings and building schools in the city. He crowned these efforts by incorporating it with Cairo in one city wall, thus offering protection to both. As a result of this attention, the city gradually began to be built up. The opportunities for building in Fustat were good from the time of Salah ad-Din, when buildings, markets and workshops were built in this area. The workshops of Fustat were called foundries, for instance the copper foundry, the steel foundry, and so on. There can be no doubt that the foundries were based in Fustat and produced both raw material and cast metal which were needed by the metal smithing industry in Egypt to produce weapons and war engines, in addition to household utensils and various kinds of decorative items. Tanis. Tanis is regarded as one of the most important centers of textile manufacture at the time of the Ayubids. Many historians and travelers spoke highly of its textile manufacturing. It is worth mentioning that the people of Tanis remained active in manufacturing and trade until Al-Malik al-Kamil Muhammad ibn Ayyub destroyed it and demolished its walls and houses in 624 Hijri, that is 1226 Common Era. Other cities. Other cities which were famous as centers of manufacturing during the Ayubid era included Damietta, Akhmim, Alexandria, Jazirat al-Rawdah, Damascus, Aleppo, and others. Abolition of levies and being content with Sharia sources of income. It comes as no surprise that there was nothing left in Salah ad-Din's treasury after he died except 46 silver dirhams and a single gold dinar. His state's income was huge, and his expenditure on war was also huge. The more lands that came under his control, the more his income from them and his spending on them increased. His principles were always as follows. 1. Abolishing illegitimate levies and taxes in all lands that he conquered. And 2. Being content with Islamically acceptable sources of income, such as zakah, jizya, tribute, booty, and the tithe, 1/10 on trade. The income from Egypt was his main source because he regarded it as his kingdom. Hence he abolished the Hajj levies that were taken from Maghribi pilgrims, and he abolished the levies on Yemeni merchants. He also abolished similar taxes in Damascus when he took control of it, and in Aleppo, Sanjar, and Raqqa. His financial policy appears in the statement that he issued when he abolished the levies in Raqqa. The worst of rulers is the one who lines his pockets at the people's expense. And the furthest from the right way is the one who takes what is not his from the people and regards it as his by right. The one who gives up something for the sake of Allah will be compensated by Allah, and the one who lends to Allah a goodly loan will be repaid by him. When our venture ended in the conquest of Raqqa, we found out about the unlawful consumption of wealth and wrongdoing, which Allah has commanded be stopped. So we obliged ourselves and the governors, who are working for us, to waive all of these taxes. We have issued orders that all these doors be closed and abolished, and that the records of these taxes be erased from the department, and that both rich and poor be let off paying them forever. Thus the taxes were abolished, which the Crusaders used to get from As-Salt, Al-Balqa, Jabal of, As-Sawad, and Al-Jawlan. The Franks used to take half of the taxes collected. Salahuddin restored the obligation of zakah, which the Fatimids had abolished, as a sign of the restoration of the Sunni madhab, making it an alternative to the illegitimate levies and taxes. He paid attention to the collection of zakah. He set up a department for it and appointed someone in charge of it, but the collection of zakah was little. Zakah was levied and collected on gold, silver, trade goods, livestock, and crops, with exceptions for foodstuffs such as sesame, flax seeds, olive oil, and vegetables. Tribute was collected according to the system and set times of Egypt, when the need arose to change from following the Hijri calendar to the solar Coptic calendar in 567 Hijri, because the times for collection had started to come before the time of production. Salahuddin made this alteration. In other regions, such as Syria and Mesopotamia, the tribute was collected based on an area of land approximately equal to 1 acre. The tax on wheat and barley was 2.5 bushels for 1 acre. The tax was collected and then paid to the Sultan's department. The rate on fava beans and chickpeas was similar, and there were cash taxes on some harvests, such as grapes and other tree fruits, which varied between 1 and 5 dinars per acre. In the third year, it was no more than 3 dinars. Those with zimmi status paid the jizya, from which children, women, and monks were exempt. It was called the community tax, and varied according to the people's circumstances, between 1 and 4.5 dinars, in addition to 2.5 dirhams to be paid by all every year. Because metal and wood were essential for making weapons, Salahuddin forbade anyone to have anything to do with them, and strictly enforced the state monopoly in these materials, because he was in a state of war with the Franks, and the punishment for anyone who smuggled any of these materials was great indeed. Most of the state's income was spent on the war: fortresses, citadels, schools, mosques, border posts, inns on the roads, hospices, salaries for state employees, and so on. Hospitals at the time of Salahuddin. In Salahuddin's time, there were no schools of medicine per se. Rather, this specialty was taught in the hospitals. After a lecture, the student would go and see patients to learn how to diagnose and treat disease. Salahuddin built a number of hospitals during his reign, including the following: the Nursery Hospital in Cairo. Salahuddin built a Nursery Hospital in Cairo, choosing one of the splendid palaces and turning it into a huge hospital. He chose for this purpose a palace that was located far away from noisy areas. Dr. Ahmed Isa explains, An-Nasiri or As-Salahi Hospital, or the Hospital of Salahuddin, when the Sultan Salahuddin took over Egypt in 567 Hijri, that is 1171 Common Era. He took control of the palace of the Fatimids. In the palace there was a hall which had been built by Al-Aziz Billah in 384 Hijri, that is 994 Common Era. Sultan Salahuddin made it a hospital, and it was the oldest hospital in the palace. Al-Qadi al-Fadil said concerning the events of 577 Hijri, that is 1181 Common Era. Al-Qadi al-Fadil said concerning the events of 577 Hijri, that is 1181 Common Era. The Sultan Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayub ordered that a hospital be opened for the sick and weak, and he chose a place in the palace. A monthly income of 200 dinars was allocated to it from the chancery, as well as some income from Fayoum, an agricultural region in Egypt. He employed in it doctors, oculists, surgeons, a supervisor, a worker and a servant, and people found great comfort and benefit in it. A Nursery Hospital was well furnished, and was one of the finest palaces. It contained all that was needed for the treatment and comfort of its patients. The traveler Ibn Jubair described the hospital which Salahuddin built in Cairo, saying, "Another of the things we saw, doing honor to the Sultan, was the hospital in the city of Cairo. It is a palace, goodly for its beauty and spaciousness. This benefaction he made seeking reward and the pleasure of Allah. He appointed as superintendent a man of science with whom he placed a store of drugs, and whom he empowered to use the potions and apply them in their various forms. In the rooms of this palace were placed beds, fully appointed for inpatients. At the disposal of the superintendent are servants whose duty it is, morning and evening, to examine the conditions of the sick, and to bring them the food and potions that befit them. Facing this establishment is another especially for sick women, and they also have persons to attend to them. A third which adjoins them, a large place, has rooms with iron windows, and it also has been taken as a place of confinement for the insane. They also have persons who daily examine their condition, and give them what is fitting for them. All these matters the Sultan oversees, examining and questioning, and demanding the greatest care and attention to them. Ali Mubarak Pasha said, "When the Sultan Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayub came to power, he allocated different parts of the Caliph's palace to his emirs to live in, and he allocated other parts as a hospital. This was the hospital that was known as Al-Atiq, which means the ancient. He put its entrance in the quarter of Al-Milukhiyah, which was the quarter of the commander-in-chief in the past. Its location is the place that is now known as Dar Ghumri al-Husri, along with neighboring houses, as we have found in the title deeds. It is at the end of the quarter, in the direction of the small gate in the direction of Qasr Shawk. From it one enters the ancient hospital." With regard to the doctors who worked in An-Nasiri Hospital, among the most famous of them were Radiyaddin al-Rahbi, Ibrahim ibn al-Rais Mamun, ibn Abi Usaybiyah, Sheikh al-Sadid ibn Abil Bayan, and Al-Qadi Nafis ad-Din ibn al-Zubair. The Hospital of Alexandria. This was built by Salahuddin when he entered Alexandria in 577 Hijri, and began to study Al-Muwatta with Sheikh Abu at-Tahir ibn Abi Auf, as well as establishing a place for the Maghribis and a school sponsored by his brother Turan Shah. The Sadahi Hospital in Jerusalem. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi founded this hospital in 583 Hijri, that is 1187 Common Era, after he liberated Jerusalem from the Crusaders and expelled them therefrom. The Encyclopedia of Palestine says, concerning the Salahi Hospital in Jerusalem, "It is part of the legacy of the Sultan Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Salahuddin established it as an endowment and appointed senior doctors for it, and he established many endowments to support it. That hospital became one of the most famous hospitals of that period, and medicine was taught as well as practiced there. The Hospital of Acre. In 583 Hijri, after the Sultan Salahuddin conquered Jerusalem and rescued it from the clutches of the Crusaders, he went to Damascus, taking a detour via Acre. When he reached Acre, he stayed in its citadel and appointed Baha'u'ddin Karakush to renovate it, refurbish it, and restore its beauty. He turned the house of the Hospitallers into an endowment of two halves, for the poor and for scholars, and he turned the bishop's house into a hospital, establishing many endowments to provide an income for it. He put its Qadi, Jamaluddin ibn al-Shaykh Abu Najib, in charge of that, and went back to Damascus with a sense of achievement and pride. Regardless of size, one hospital might differ from another in terms of its style and decor, the size of the gardens attached to it, and the number of fountains it contained. Nevertheless, the hospitals also had a basic plan, according to which they all contained the following. 1. Sections which were just for men, and other separate sections just for women. 2. Different wards according to specialties. So there were wards that were just for patients affected by fevers, other wards for mental and psychological illness, others for eye diseases, and so on. 3. Special wards where those who were convalescing stayed until they were fully recovered. 4. Wards where doctors could examine patients who were unconscious. 5. Rooms for the head doctor and their administrators. 6. A lecture hall in which the head doctor gave his lessons and met with his students. 7. A library. 8. A kitchen for cooking healthy foods, as food was one of the means of treatment used, and also for making drinks and other remedies. 9. A pharmacy for preparing medicines. 10. Stores. 11. A room for washing the dead. 12. A prayer room or mosque. And 12. Toilets and baths. In addition, there were yards, courtyards and gardens containing fragrant trees and edible plants. Many of these hospitals also contained housing quarters for those who worked in them. End of part 1 of chapter 5. Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayubid State. Start of Part 2 of Chapter 5. Sufi Khanqahs. The word khanqah is a Persian word which originally means a dining table or the place where the king eats. After that it was applied to the khanqahs or houses, which were established by kings and emirs who were seeking to do acts of righteousness and good deeds, by providing accommodation for Muslim strangers who came to their countries, and by giving them food and educating them. Even though the 5 daily obligatory prayers were offered in special rooms in these khanqahs that were set aside for prayer, Jummah prayers were not held there. The khanqah, which was a house for Sufis, was more like a school, because it was in fact a school for the masses, for those who devoted themselves to a life of asceticism and austerity, whether they were ordinary people or artisans and craftsmen, who were trying to implement the principle of enjoining what is good and forbidding what is evil in the streets and markets. Thus the khanqah resembled a school in appearance and function. To sum up, the khanqah in Islam was something like a place of knowledge and worship that played an important religious, social, and cultural role in the life of Muslim society from the beginning. At first, they were institutions for the schools of jurisprudence and hadith, and then they became beacons of culture because of their libraries which contained books on many branches of knowledge. There were many types of employment in the khanqah, such as the sheikh of the khanqah, the imam, supervisor of its endowment, teachers of the schools of jurisprudence, assistant teachers, oculists, surgeons, pharmacists, librarians, keeper of attendance records, muazzin, supervisor of the bathhouse, supervisor of the kitchen, cook, servant of the sheikh, caretaker of the wooden chest in which copies of the Quran were kept, doorkeepers, housekeepers, drawers of water, hewers of wood, and so on. If this number of positions indicates anything, it indicates the number of various jobs that there were in these khanqahs. Each of these people was paid a salary in cash for his work, and the man in charge of the endowment made sure that the salary was appropriate to how well off he was and his position in society. That was in addition to the rewards they received in the form of food such as vegetables, meat, rice, milk, honey, sweets, and so on, as well as clothing, soap, and other provisions that were distributed to them in abundance. Salahuddin followed the method of his master Nuruddin by paying attention to these institutions and the Sufis who came to them. He treated them kindly and consulted them about many issues, and he respected their scholars, sat with them and listened to their advice. They stood with him in his wars against the Crusaders in many battles. Salahuddin had grown up with his father Najmuddin Ayub, who was generous, had a good attitude, and was very kind to the poor and Sufis, with whom he often mixed. Ibn Kathir noted, he was courageous, prayed a great deal, and sponsored a khanqah in Egypt and another in Damascus. In Baalbek, Ibn Khalikan saw a Sufi khanqah that was called Najmiya, after Najmuddin, and he praised him for being very righteous. Nevertheless, the great influence on Salahuddin's attitude and character came from his master Nuruddin, from whom he had learned ways of doing good, to love people who are close to Allah, and to strive in various ways of jihad. He followed the same path that Nuruddin had followed before him, before he started to liberate the land from the clutches of the Crusaders. He spent 12 years from 570 to 582 Hijri, striving to achieve unity and restore the material and spiritual strength of Islam. So he increased the building of ribats, khanqahs, and hospices, turning them into military and regular schools. As Safadi said, he superseded Nuruddin in all of that. Salahuddin is regarded as having been the first one to introduce these places into Egypt. Al-Qashandi said, with regard to khanqahs and ribats, they were unknown in Egypt before the time of the Ayubid state. They were introduced by Salahuddin ibn Ayub, Al-Makrizi, As-Sayyuti and others agreed with him on this point. Salah was the first one to build khanqahs for the Sufis in Egypt, and he established many endowments for them. Their inhabitants were known for their knowledge and righteousness, and prominent people, from whom blessing was sought, were appointed as their sheikhs, in addition to their positions as wazirs, amirs, state administrators, army commanders, and leaders of troops. These things attracted the attention of the Andalusian traveler Ibn Jubair during his journey to the east, and he said, "Among the features of this land, that is Egypt, and its sources of pride, which are in fact attributable to its sultan, are the schools and ribats which are set up for the seekers of knowledge and worshippers. The sultan who has introduced these good traditions is Salah-ad-Din. He is Salah-ad-Din the Victorious. May Allah increase him in righteousness and guidance." Wherever Salah-ad-Din went and halted, he built Sharia schools and khanqahs side by side. During Salah-ad-Din's conquest of Jerusalem in 583 Hijri, he ordered the Muslims to preserve the Church of the Resurrection, and he built nearby a school for the Shafi'i scholars of jurisprudence and a ribat for the righteous Sufis, and established endowments to support them. Thus he did a favor to both groups. During his conquest of Acre, he allocated half of the house of the Hospitallers as a ribat for the Sufis, and the other half as a school for the scholars of jurisprudence. We see nothing strange in these actions of Salah-ad-Din, especially since we know that both groups accompanied him during his campaigns and conquests, and the historians have highlighted to us the presence of these two groups, especially during the conquest of Jerusalem. Ibn Khalikan said, "His conquest was great, and was witnessed by a number of scholars and ragged ascetics. This fact is reinforced by the words of Ibn al-Wardi in his Tarikh, where he said, many of the ragged ascetics and scholars were present at his conquests in Egypt and Syria, and none of them stayed behind. Salah-ad-Din would take Sufi scholars with him so that he could seek their opinions and consult them, in addition to the fact that their presence was regarded as a strong incentive for their followers to fight with rare courage. The character of Salah-ad-Din was liked by the Sufis. He followed a path of asceticism, not keeping enough wealth to be subjected to zakah, and not leaving behind in his treasury anything but 47 dirhams and a single gold piece. He left behind no property, house, real estate, garden, village, cultivated land, or any other type of wealth. In this world he was content with the shade of a tent blown right and left by the wind. For Salah-ad-Din, gold and mud were all the same. Ibn Shaddad noted, "I heard him say in a discussion that there may be people who look upon wealth as they look upon dust, and it was as if he was referring to himself." There are many reports which confirm the asceticism of Salah-ad-Din and the simplicity of his food and clothing, whilst he bestowed generous gifts upon the scholars of jurisprudence and Sufis, and established entire villages, with all that they contained of resources and profits, to serve as endowments for hospices and houses for the poor. Salah-ad-Din built inns in isolated places far away from civilization, and on the routes that connected cities, to serve wayfarers and travelers. Ibn Jubair saw the inn that Salah-ad-Din built on the road between Homs and Damascus, which was called Khan as-Sultan. The Amir Bahad-Din Karakush also built wayfarers' inns. Salah-ad-Din paid attention to attracting scholars and the Sufis. He established the first khanqah for the Sufis in Egypt, and devoted it to the poor Sufis who came from all over the world. He established great endowments for them and appointed a sheikh for them to run their affairs, who was known as the Sheikh of Sheikhs. Al-Makrizi stated that its Sufi inhabitants were known for knowledge and righteousness, and the number of people living there was 300. The Sultan allocated bread and sweets for them every day, and 40 dirhams per year for clothing, and he built a bathhouse for them nearby. If any of them wanted to travel, he would give him money to help him reach his destination. This attention that was paid to Sufi affairs was intended to serve several aims, some of which had to do with the Sunni revival movement. Although moderate Sufism was a trend which was respected by both rulers and common folk at that time, this kind of attention that was paid to it in Egypt in particular was a deliberate action aimed at achieving a specific goal. Perhaps the reason for this was that the Fatimids in Egypt had failed, despite their various methods of calling people to their madhab, in changing the beliefs of the majority of Egyptians. But they had easily affected their emotions. The displays of grief and mourning for Al-Hussein, and the celebrations of the birthdays of Ahl al-Bayt, and the attention paid by the Fatimids to these and other occasions, all of that had had an effect on the Egyptians' emotions, and traces of that can still be seen today. Salah ad-Din tried to attract Sunni scholars to Egypt from all over, to contribute their knowledge and ideas to the Sunni revival movement. There was another important aspect which it was essential to fulfill, and turn it away from the direction in which it had been going under the Fatimids, and find another outlet for it. That was the people's emotions, which the Fatimids had easily dominated. The Sunni Sufis and their followers were among those who could fulfill this aspect at that time, with their easygoing attitude, their shunning of worldly delights, and their ability to address people in their gatherings, which were usually for the purpose of exhortation, zikr, and so on. Thus Salah ad-Din, like Nuruddin before him, was able to benefit from the Sunni Sufi groups in the Sunni revival movement, and in confronting Shi'ism and the Crusader invasion. Social reform. Social life at the time of Salah ad-Din was characterized by its serious nature, resistance to the Franks and striving against the enemy. It was far removed from displays of ostentation and extreme extravagance, or false displays of greatness. Salah ad-Din, may Allah have mercy on him, set a good example to his troops and his subjects by wearing ordinary clothing, eating coarse food, and mixing with people in a humble manner. Al-Imad al-Isfahani said, describing his clothing and his way of mixing with people, he wore nothing but that which it is permissible to wear, such as linen, cotton, and wool, and anyone who sat with him would not feel that he was sitting with a sultan, because of his humbleness. Salah ad-Din was an athletic man who loved horsemanship and ball games, and encouraged others to engage in them too. He would ride to watch ball games and polo after Zohar prayer, accompanied by his men. When he reached the field, he would dismount and watch the game, and the players would continue playing until the Azan for Asr prayer. He would also take part in these games with his inner circle, and would go out to play with some of his friends. Hunting and fishing were also beloved pastimes. People would go out in groups or alone to hunt birds and catch fish, or to hunt geese and rabbits. If this phenomena indicates anything, it is indicative of complete readiness and preparedness to engage in battle, with extreme bravery and unparalleled courage. Among the major reforms that Salah ad-Din achieved in Muslim society was suppressing manifestations of promiscuity and immorality that were widespread at the time of the Fatimids. especially on special occasions and festivals, such as the Nowruz festival. If we want to know the extent of this immorality that was widespread in Egyptian society before the days of Salah ad-Din, let us listen to what al-Makrizi has said. Evil was manifest during the festival of Nowruz, when there would be a large gathering, and effeminate men and immoral women would gather beneath the Pearl Palace, where the Caliph could see them, with musical instruments in their hands. Voices would become loud and wine would be drunk in the streets, and the people would throw water at one another, or water and wine, or water mixed with filth. If a decent person made the mistake of coming out of his house, he would be met by people who would sprinkle him and make his clothes dirty, and humiliate him, and he would either have to give something to ransom himself or be exposed. Salah ad-Din abolished these immoral goings-on and blatant evil, and restored an innocent and clean life. He brought back to them the morals and etiquette of Islam. Another of the corrupt phenomena that he abolished was the innovated occasions and festivals, such as the innovations on the day of Ashura, which was a day of grief and mourning for the Fatimids, on which there was a lot of weeping and wailing out loud. People did not work and the markets were closed, and there was widespread chaos, as if each individual had lost the dearest of people to him. Salah ad-Din was able to put an end to these blameworthy customs and innovations. With regard to his generosity towards the people and his distribution of gifts to them, there is much to be said. He would give like one who did not fear poverty. He would give like one who did not fear poverty, because the way he regarded wealth was like that of one who was looking at dust. We have already seen that when he died he left behind in his treasury nothing but 47 silver dirhams and a single gold piece. He left behind no property, house, real estate, garden, village, cultivated land, or any other type of wealth. Instead, he spent a great deal of wealth on restoration projects and preparing the means of warfare, and on deserving cases among the people, until he achieved complete security in society where no one was in need. The state was strong and all people enjoyed a good living. This is what this just sultan and heroic leader achieved. Among the actions for which Salah ad-Din will be forever remembered is his abolition of many of the taxes which burdened society and caused the people great harm, such as the taxes that were imposed by the Emir of Mecca on the pilgrims. The ruler of Mecca had ordered that the pilgrims pay the levies of Mecca in advance in Jeddah, and the pilgrims were treated unfairly. Salah ad-Din abolished this entire system and compensated the governor of Mecca by paying him a lump sum. Every year he sent to him 8,000 measures of wheat and stipulated that it be distributed among the people of the two holy sanctuaries. Salah ad-Din also abolished the taxes that were imposed on the people, and with one lump sum paid from the treasury, he benefited the people of the two holy sanctuaries. Another thing that points to his good intentions, his keenness to keep the people safe and unite the Ummah, and his care to avoid wrongdoing, is the advice he gave to his son Al-Malik al-Zahir, whom he appointed as governor of Aleppo. He advised him, as recorded by his Qadi Ibn Shaddad, I urge you to fear Allah, for it is the root of all goodness, and I enjoin you to adhere to that which Allah commands you, for it is the means of your salvation. I warn you against shedding blood and indulging therein, for blood never sleeps. I urge you to be kind to the people, and to take care of them, for you are my trustee and the trustee of Allah over them. I urge you to be kind to the emirs, state officials, and prominent people, for I have not attained the position I have attained except by being kind to people. Do not bear grudges against anyone, for that will not leave anyone. Watch the relationship between you and people, for sins concerning them cannot be forgiven except with their consent. But what is between you and Allah will be forgiven if you repent, for He is the most generous. These are the most important social and moral reforms undertaken by Salahuddin, which enabled Muslim society during his rule to flourish with the noblest character, best traditions, and finest etiquette. Infrastructure. Another of these reforms was the attention that he paid to the wall of Cairo, most of which had been destroyed and no longer prevented anyone from entering or leaving. Thus he rebuilt the wall. He appointed as supervisor of this rebuilding of the wall At-Tawashi Bahad-Din Karakush. The wall extended around the cities that formed the city of Cairo at that time, namely the city of Fustad, which was founded by Amr ibn Alas, the city of Al-Askar, which was founded by Saleh ibn Ali al-Abbasi, and the city of Cairo, which was founded by Jawhar as-Siqili. The aim behind building this wall was to protect the city from aggressors. In addition to building the wall, he built Qalat al-Jabal, the citadel of the mountain, to defend Cairo from treacherous attacks. But he was not able to finish building it all, because he was distracted by wars in various arenas. This citadel is regarded as one of the fortified relics of Egyptian history, which has been altered frequently down throughout the ages. Other citadels built by Salahuddin include Qalatsina, which he built in the Sinai Peninsula, 57 kilometers northeast of the city of As-Suwais, which is the Suez. To the south of the citadel, he also built two neighboring mosques and cisterns to provide water. On the doors of the cisterns the following lines were written: In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. May Allah send blessings upon our Master Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah cause the kingdom of our Lord An-Nasir Salah al-Dunya wa-Din, the King of Islam and the Muslims, the Caliph of the Commander of the Faithful, to abide forever. This cistern was built by Al-Malik Ali ibn An-Nasir al-Adil al-Muzaffar. Construction was completed in Shaban 590 Hijri. Professor Naum Shukair says in his book Tarikh Sina wal Arab. He passed by the citadel and the two mosques, and he saw that the citadel had a large gate on its northwest side, and over the lintel of the door there was a square historical Arabic stone, on which was carved in relief the name of Salahuddin, and the words, In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. May Allah send blessings upon Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah cause the kingdom of our Lord Al-Malik An-Nasir Salahuddin, the Sultan of Islam and the Muslims, Yusuf al-Adil An-Nasir, to abide forever. Jamadi Usani, 583 Hijri. Salahuddin's interest in building military fortifications was not everything. He also paid attention to developing Jazirat al-Rawdah and Giza, building the Nilometer, and digging irrigation ditches, as well as building hospitals, schools and khanqahs. At the time of Salahuddin, the cities of Giza and al-Rawdah were the most important part of the country. He also paid attention to developing Jazirat al-Rawdah and Giza, building the Nilometer and digging irrigation ditches, as well as building hospitals, schools and khanqahs. At the time of Salahuddin, the cities of Giza and al-Rawdah were the most important part of the country. Ibn Jubair says in his Rihlah, In Giza, there is a large market every Sunday where many congregate. Between it and Fustad, there is an island, a Rota, with fine houses and commanding belvederes, which is a resort for entertainment and diversion. Between this island and Fustad, there is a canal from the Nile. On this island is a congregational mosque in which the khutbah is delivered. Beside this mosque is the Nilometer, which measures the Nile's increase or decrease. In it there is stone and marble, and other kinds of beauty and artistry. Salahuddin built irrigation channels and developed the fleet, and he established a special department for the fleet that was called Diwan al-Ustul, which he handed over to his brother Al-Adil. Alexandria and Damietta were the most important seaports in Egypt, and Fustat and Kos were the most important Nile ports. In them were built the warships that guarded those borders, and went out on naval campaigns to make the word of Islam prevail, and its banner fly in all places. Salahuddin thought of Alexandria and its strategic importance in resisting the Crusader venture, and ordered that its walls and towers be rebuilt. He also built a hospital there, and tended to its bridges and irrigation ditches in order to improve the lot of its farmers. Many factors contributed to the development of infrastructure at the time of Salahuddin, including religious, geographic, political, administrative, economic, military, social, and cultural factors. Dr. Adnan al-Harisi discussed them in detail in his useful book Umran al-Qahira wa Khutatuha fi Ahda Salahuddin al-Ayubi. Dr. Izzuddin Faraj discussed the features of the Ayubid style of development. The most important feature of development in Ayubid Egypt was those fortifications with their towers and gates, which were added to the walls and citadels. The gates which Salahuddin built were of the staggered type, which was a new design aimed at making fortresses stronger. The gate did not go through the wall in a straight line like an ordinary gate. Rather, the enemy was forced to go through a gate between two towers, in which there were openings through which arrows could be shot into an exposed area, where there was no protection for those who were coming in. There was also a new construction element that was used by Salahuddin in these fortifications, which was a stone balcony that jutted out from the wall. This was equipped with narrow openings from which the troops could shoot their arrows at the attacking enemy from the front and sides. Professor Croswell was proven that Eastern architectural elements, as well as the design of schools with intersecting halls, were established and developed in Egypt, and this idea did not come from elsewhere. During this era, the use of decorative plaster and carpentry work also continued to flourish, and Naskhi calligraphy appeared alongside Kufi calligraphy. Administrative reform. The emergence of the Ayubid state had a great impact on the creation of new official administrative developments, which differed from the traditional Fatimid model. Al-Qalqashandi states that when the Ayubid state took over from the Fatimid state, it differed from it in the way of running affairs and changed most of its features. When the Ayubids arrived from the Muslim East, they brought with them a new administrative spirit, which was based on the Seljuk, Zangid, and Abbasid systems. Many changes were introduced into the administration, among the most prominent of which were new administrative posts, such as the Sultan's deputy, which reflected the necessity of the Sultan leaving the country because of the wars with the Crusaders. Hence there was a need for someone to act as his deputy during his absence. Salahuddin divided his state into administrative regions, each of which had its own resources and distinct character, such as Egypt, Greater Syria, northern Iraq, Nubia, the Maghreb, Yemen, and the Hijaz. He spent most of the years of his rule on the battlefield, exercising a policy of planning, executing, and supervising, while guiding the overall policy of the state. He allowed freedom of execution to the governors, with regard to local issues, such as jihad, preparedness, and defense, according to the circumstances and resources of each province. This is what is known in modern parlance as decentralization. In fact, Salahuddin did not hold all the reins of authority in his own hands, despite the fact that he was also running the affairs of the central government. It is most likely that he realized that the distribution of power would make each governor watch over the others and compare himself to the others in the way in which he exercised his special authority. Dividing the work among a number of qualified people also achieved a number of advantages that had to do with the quality and speed of work. Cairo was the center of his government, where his deputies and viziers lived, and whence his commands were issued to different regions, and Greater Syria was his theater of war and the arena of his jihad against the Crusaders. He appointed the highest state positions to his sons, relatives, and the closest of people to him, so as to protect his system and method of ruling and leadership. When selecting them, his choice was based on a rational approach, to the extent that he dismissed his son Al-Malik al-Tahir Ghazi from his post as governor of Aleppo and gave it to his brother Al-Adil when the interests of the state called for that. When he annexed an Islamic emirate into his state, he would leave its rulers in place if they agreed to come under his authority and implement his policies to serve his aims, rather the aims of Islam as a whole. If any of them refused, he would allow him to go wherever he wanted. He used peaceful methods in order to reach an understanding with them. If any of them rebelled against him, he would overlook his mistakes and receive him with a cheerful face and honor him a great deal, as he did in the case of Taqiyuddin Umar, when he wanted to rebel against him and go to the Maghreb after he was dismissed from his post as governor of Egypt. Salahuddin paid attention to the public interest when appointing or dismissing governors, in addition to the political and military circumstances of the state. His conduct was distinguished by justice and humility. He did not hurt the feelings of anyone, or put himself above anyone or behave arrogantly towards anyone. Tyranny was not part of his nature. Baha'u'ddin Karakush. Baha'u'ddin Karakush was one of the administrators of the Ayubid state. He was a Roman Byzantine slave who had fled from one of the villages of Asia Minor and moved from one land to another until he reached Syria. Then he joined the entourage of Asaduddin Shirkuh, who recognized his potential for smartness and courage. So he drew him close to him and started training him in horsemanship and developing his fighting skills. In Damascus, he was called Baha'u'ddin ibn Abdullah al-Asadi, after Asaduddin Shirkuh, who had brought him, trained him, and taught him, and was the cause of his embracing Islam. Baha'u'ddin soon climbed the army ladder and reached the position of commander. At the head of this army was the heroic leader Asaduddin Shirkuh, who had entered Egypt during the final years of the Fatimid state. Later on, Egypt had ended up in the hands of the commander Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, which led to the demolishing of the Fatimid state, and the Ayubid state was established in its stead. The meaning of the name Karakush in Turkish is osprey, which is a bird of prey. This name is given to a man for his chivalry and courage. The name is composed of two words, Qara meaning black and Kush meaning bird or eagle. Ibn Khalikan mentioned some detail of his life story saying, it was said that he was the servant of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, the paternal uncle of the Sultan Salahuddin, who manumitted him. When Salahuddin took full control of Egypt, he put him in charge of the palace. Then he acted as his deputy in Egypt for a while. Salahuddin delegated the affairs of Egypt to him, and he relied on him to manage its affairs. He was a fortunate man, and a man of high ambition. Ibn Kathir wrote a biography of him in Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya. The Amir Bahauddin Karakush was a scholar and faqih, but he devoted himself to administrative and military service. The life of the Amir Bahauddin Karakush was filled with great achievements, heroic acts, and sincerity towards Islam and the Muslims during the time he was close to the leader Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, and after he died, which made him a focal point for the plots of those who envied him and the enemies of Islam and the Muslims. Among the actions that were delegated to him and in which he did well were guarding the Fatimid palace. When Salahuddin appointed him to guard the Fatimid palace, so that none of its treasures could be leaked to the opponents of Ahl Sunnah, the Emir undertook this mission in the best manner and guarded the Fatimid palace with an eye that never slept. The conspirators tried in vain to get hold of the wealth they needed to spend on this conspiracy, and they did not succeed. This was one of the factors that contributed to the failure of the conspiracy. This was the conspiracy of the Caliph's confidant, which we discussed previously. The Fatimid palace contained treasures such as no eye had ever seen. Fine clothing, valuable jewelry, splendid treasures, precious stones such as rubies and emeralds, golden artifacts, silver vessels, necklaces and pearls. The Amir Karakush guarded these treasures in the best manner, until Allah granted victory to the commander Salahuddin and gave him power in the land. Building Qalat al-Jabal. When the commander Salahuddin returned from Syria and saw what the Amir Bahauddin had achieved during his absence, in which the Amir had demonstrated his brilliance and great experience in engineering, he ordered him to build for him a citadel to protect Fustad, and left him to choose its location and determine its size. The Amir Bahauddin selected an elevated piece of land in Jabal al-Muqattam, which overlooks the whole of Cairo, to be the site of the citadel. He started to build it in 572 Hijri, and the construction of the citadel was part of a series of fortifications and military installations undertaken by the Ayubids to secure the cities of Egypt such as Fustat and Cairo. Hence the constructions had the outward appearance of fortifications, with towers and strong gates, and inside there were splendid buildings for the Sultan, which impressed all the travelers and historians who visited them. The citadel was built on a high rocky hill, which increased its strength and solidity. Ibn Jubair commented, we also looked upon the building of the citadel, an impregnable fortress adjoining Cairo, which the Sultan thinks to take as his residence, extending its walls until it enfolds the two cities of Fustat and Cairo. The forced laborers on this construction, and those executing all the skilled services and vast preparations, such as sawing the marble, cutting the huge stones, and digging the fosse that girdles the walls noted above, a fosse hollowed out with pickaxes from the rock to be a wonder amongst the wonders of which traces may remain, were the foreign Roman prisoners whose numbers were beyond computation. There was no cause for any but them to labor on this construction. Bir Yusuf, which means Yusuf's well. Inside the citadel, the Amir Bahad-Din built an amazing well that was dug very deep into the rock. This well until today is still called Bir Yusuf, or Yusuf's well, after Yusuf Salahuddin. Professor Ali Pasha Mubarak says, the well known as Al-Halazun, which means the snail, which is located inside the citadel, is the work of Katakush during the days of Salahuddin. It was dug to provide water inside the citadel if it were to be besieged by the enemy. The walls of Cairo, the citadel, and Fustad. After building the citadel in 567 Hijri, the Amir Bahad-Din extended the northern wall of Fatimid Cairo to the west until it reached the port of Al-Maqsi on the Nile, which is now the location of Masjid al-Fath al-Jadid in Ramsey Square. This is the same site that was occupied by Jami Aulad an-Nan before it was transferred. He also extended the wall eastwards until it joined the old northern Fatimid wall, which lay east of the quarter of Ad-Darb al-Ahmar. He extended the third wall from south of the citadel to Bab al-Qurafa, at the city of Fustad, a distance of 5.5 kilometers. The wall that was built by the Amir Karakush was the third wall that surrounded Cairo at that time. The first wall had been built by the Byzantine general Jawhar al-Siqili. The second was built by the Fatimid Wazir and army commander Badr al-Jamali, and the third was built of stone by the Amir Karakush. The wall went around the four cities which formed the city of Cairo at that time, which were Fustad, Al-Askar, Cairo or Al-Qahira, and Fustad. The Great Wall of Cairo was regarded as one of the greatest military installations built during this era. The one who was appointed to supervise this work was the Amir Bahad-Din Karakush, who demonstrated brilliance, vast experience, and great energy in building military installations. Every time Salahuddin needed to build any military installation, he sought the help of the Amir Bahad-Din. The bridges of Giza and the citadel of Al-Maqsi. Among the constructions and military installations built by the Amir Bahad-Din were the bridges of Giza, which are located beneath the bridge that connects the Nile and the pyramids, in the direction of the city of Fustad. It was stated that he demolished the small pyramids that were scattered in Giza, and took the stones to build the bridges. Another was the citadel of Al-Maqsi, which was the name of a large tower built by the Amir Bahad-Din at the bridge of the Caliphs, near the Jame Mosque at the end of the wall of Cairo, at Bab al-Bahar. Its location is the site where the Okaf building and the Ratib Pasha building now stand, next to Jami'ul Adnan, in the direction of Al-Bahriya Ash-Sharqiyya, in Bab al-Hadid Square. As governor of Acre, his renovation of its walls. In Muharram 585 Hijri, Salahuddin went to Acre and stayed there, putting its affairs in order. He put the Amir Bahad-Din Karakush in charge of it and ordered him to develop it and renovate its walls. We will discuss Acre and what happened there below. Origin of the saying, as harsh and irrational as the ruling of Karakush. Karakush was one of the bravest and most brilliant commanders. On one occasion he was captured and was ransomed for 10,000 dinars, and Salah ad-Din rejoiced greatly when he was ransomed. It seems that the way he ran the affairs of Cairo was very wise and decisive. He removed the Fatimids from power and kept a tight grip on their remnants, so they could find no way to fight him, except by spreading rumors and trying to tarnish his reputation. So they wrote a book about him called Al-Fashush fi Ahkam Karakush, which means strange stories about the rule of Karakush, which is nothing more than rumors which are repeated foolishly by our contemporaries. Ibn Khalikan stated that the people attributed bizarre verdicts to the Emir Bahauddin Karakush when he was serving as Salah ad-Din's deputy. In his book, Al-Asad ibn Mamati mentioned far-fetched and unlikely events, which it seems were fabricated. Salah ad-Din relied on Karakush with regard to running the kingdom, and were it not for his confidence in his knowledge and ability, he would not have entrusted that to him. The book by Al-Asad ibn Mamati is thus the origin of this saying, which became widespread in all regions, from the date it first appeared and until now. It is a small book that contains stories and funny anecdotes, written in the vernacular, discrediting the Emir Bahauddin Karakush and showing him to be the opposite of what he really was. It makes him appear as a laughable character, like the character of Juha in the tradition of comic folklore. The aim of Ibn Mamati was to undermine the Emir Bahauddin Karakush. Ibn Khalikan was of the opinion that this book was entirely fabricated, because Al-Asad ibn Mamati was close to, and indeed a part of the Ayubid court, so how could he have denounced and condemned the system of which he was a part? In fact, the motive behind this book, which slandered the Emir Bahauddin Karakush, Salah ad-Din, and the entire Ayubid state, was a propaganda campaign and plan that was drawn up to undermine the Sultan Salah ad-Din and the Ayubid state at the peak of its glory. The aim was to damage this state that played such a prominent role in putting an end to the Fatimid state and defeating the invading Crusaders. What we can also be certain of is that the fact that the book was written in the form of a letter, offering advice to the Sultan Salah ad-Din in the vernacular, is indicative of the craftiness and malicious intent of its author. In fact, he managed to achieve his goal, which is borne out by the speed with which the lies contained in this book spread and were repeated by people as if they were true. Even Nasuyuti was influenced by it and narrated it to his students, as is seen in the Paris MS, even though he acknowledged that Amir Bahauddin Karakush was a righteous man who was more inclined to do so. The aim behind the book Al-Fashush fi Ahkam Karakush was to shake people's confidence in the Amir Bahauddin Karakush, who was a prominent leader and trustworthy assistant of Salah ad-Din, whose help the latter sought at times of crisis. This misinformation was intended to rally and incite the people against the Sunni Ayubid state, which had put an end to Shiite Fatimid rule, so the book was no more than a means of political propaganda against the Sunni venture. End of Part 2 of Chapter 5. End of Chapter 5. Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayubid State. Start of Chapter 6, Part 1, The Military System at the Time of Salahuddin. Salahuddin began to fortify cities, build citadels and organize the army to withstand the possibility of attacks against him. At that time, he focused on building up naval forces because he was aware of the strength of the Franks at sea and their weakness on land, and he realized that it was essential to build a war fleet to block Frankish naval convoys which could supply the Crusader kingdoms on the Syrian coast with food, weapons, and men every time the pressure against them on land increased. In addition to that, Salahuddin discovered that the structure of the state in Egypt was weak and vulnerable, so he had no option but to reorganize its legislative and administrative affairs before confronting the Franks. Salahuddin realized the importance of keeping the trade and transportation routes between the Mediterranean and Red Sea open, and he recognized the difference between the interests of the merchants of the Mediterranean European cities and the ambitions of the rulers of the Latin kingdoms in Central, Western, and Northern Europe. So he signed trade agreements with them in return for their breaking their ties with the rulers of those kingdoms. Another thing that he realized was that the Franks were attempting to extend their domination from the coast of Syria and Palestine to the Red Sea, and he recognized the possibility that trade caravans may be exposed from the rear, as well as the possibility that the Hajj caravans may also be exposed to danger. Hence he ordered that his army be sent to Yemen to secure the sea lanes and put an end to pirate activity and attacks against pilgrim caravans. Development of the military feudal system at the time of Salahuddin. In the Ayubid feudal system, fiefs were given in return for military service. It was not, however, an heritable system, as the bestowing of a fief by the Ayubid Sultan did not mean that ownership of the agricultural land was being given to the recipient, nor did it mean that the recipient could enjoy the yield of the fief on a long-term basis. Rather, the bestowal of a fief simply meant that the recipient had the right to collect for himself and his troops a certain amount of taxes in return for military and civil duties that he was obliged to do. Salahuddin began to allocate the land of Egypt in the form of fiefs. He gave some to his family members and some to his emirs and commanders. He allocated Alexandria, Damietta, and Buhaira to his father Najmuddin, and he allocated Kuz, Aswan, and Aizhab to his brothers Shamsuddin Turan Shah. That is supported by, among other things, what al-Makrizi noted. Since the time of Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayub and up till now, all the land of Egypt is allocated as fiefs to the Sultan and his emirs and troops. At the time of Salahuddin, the allocation of military fiefs was a practice not limited only to Egypt. Rather, it was extended to all the lands that Salahuddin was able to incorporate into the venture of Islamic unity. He followed a number of methods of distributing those fiefs to his emirs and troops, such as that which was aimed at confirming his control of the lands that came under his sway, as when he captured Homs and Hama in 570 Hijri, that is 1174 Common Era, when he allocated a fief to his paternal cousin Nasir-ad-Din Muhammad ibn Asad-ad-Din Shirkuh, and another to his maternal uncle Shihab-ad-Din al-Hazimi. Salahuddin also used the allocation of fiefs as a means of achieving Islamic unity. This is indicated by the call that he sent when he halted at Bira, when he wrote to the kings of neighboring cities saying, "Whoever comes and submits willingly, his land will be safe, provided that he is one of the Sultan's troops, and one of his followers and helpers in the jihad against the disbelievers." He acted on the same basis with Imad ad-Din Zangi, Izz-ad-Din Masud, the ruler of Mosul, and the ruler of Antab, when he wrote to the Sultan announcing that he would obey him. When he took control of it, he affirmed it as his fief in 579 Hijri, that is 1183 Common Era. Salah ad-Din also awarded fiefs to his men as a reward for their great exploits. This is what Salah ad-Din did with the Amir of Hasan Kaf, which he allocated to Hamid as a reward for services rendered to Salah ad-Din. He did likewise with Saif ad-Din al-Mashtub when the Crusaders released him from captivity. Salah ad-Din welcomed him warmly and allocated Nablus and its surroundings to him as a fief in 588 Hijri, that is 1192 Common Era. It may also be noted that when allocating fiefs, Salah ad-Din paid attention to security matters in his state. He allocated fiefs to Arab tribes whose people often betrayed him and sent food supplies to the Crusaders. He allocated various fiefs in Egypt to the tribes of Juzam and Talaba, so as to maintain security and encourage those Bedouin to join him in the jihad. Another of the unique characteristics of the Ayubid feudal system was that it allowed fiefs to be transferred from one beneficiary to another, but this transfer was not done through inheritance. At the time of Salah ad-Din, no fief was transferred by inheritance except in 3 cases. In return for the income acquired from the fief, the beneficiary had a number of commitments that he was obliged to fulfill. These were military commitments such as sending troops at times of war, in addition to a number of non-military obligations, such as implementing decrees issued by Salah ad-Din, establishing security within the fief, and paying attention to the welfare of individuals living in the fief. In addition to that, the recipient had a number of civil duties, the most important of which had to do with irrigation and cultivation of the fief, and some special services to the Sultan. The fief sometimes contained lands that were already developed and cultivated as the result of prior construction of irrigation ditches and bridges. In that case, the recipients had to do their utmost to improve this developed land, in addition to building and maintaining Jusur Baladiya, which were small agricultural dams which played a major role in irrigation of the fiefs. Jusur Sultaniya, on the other hand, were large agricultural dams which were built to benefit whole regions, so the recipients of fiefs were not responsible for them in theory. But in fact, they did help the Sultan to build this kind of dam by supplying men, cattle, equipment, and so on. In addition to that, the recipient also took part in digging and cleaning channels. Salah ad-Din used the same method as had been used by his Zangid forebears in paying the troops' salaries. He allocated fiefs to his commanders as an alternative to what was required of paying salaries to the troops. It was sufficient for Salah ad-Din to notify the recipient of the fief when he decided to launch the jihad against the Crusaders, and the recipient would march to join him with his troops, fully equipped with sufficient food supplies. Because Salah ad-Din was the original source for allocation of fiefs, he could cancel a fief at any time if the recipient failed to carry out his duties or behaved in such a manner that undermined his military commitments, as happened in 573 Hijri, that is 1177 Common Era, when Salah ad-Din took Akhbaz away from a group of Kurds because they were the cause of the Muslim army's defeat at the Battle of Al-Ramlah at Tel Asafiyah by the Crusader army, led by Renaud de Chatillon. In fact, the military feudal system was very important to the army of Salah ad-Din. Moreover, this system, with the duties it involved, punished the fief holder by dismissing him from his fiefdom if he fell short in any of these duties, and guaranteed the sincerity of the troops and their standing firm in battle. This is in addition to what some of the fief holders did of military actions against the enemy. Ibn Wasil and Ibn Kathir mention, among the events of 575 Hijri, that is 1179 Common Era, that is that Din Farah Shah, whose fief at that time was Baalbek, raided Safad in that year, and came back safe and sound after killing a large number of Crusader fighters and seizing a large amount of booty. In addition to that, the military feudal system was regarded as one of the main sources of income for the Ayubid state, because it was a source of permanent income that was required to spend on the Sultan's army and the armies of the feudal emirs, in addition to important military expenditure on the army at the times of war. Thus it may be said that by implementing the military feudal system in his state, Salah ad-Din saved himself the task of supplying the entire army with weapons, equipment, and supplies. Salah ad-Din's military department. This department was responsible for army affairs and was supervised by one who had knowledge and experience of the affairs of this institution, on the condition that he was a Muslim of high rank and prominent status. It was akin to what we call the Ministry of Defense nowadays, and the man in charge of it was responsible for knowing the situation of the troops and recording their presence or absence, state of health, and deaths. One of the duties of the military department was issuing regular statistics on the numbers of troops and the amount of money allocated to them. One of this department's specialities was mentioned by Ibn Khalikan in his biography of Al-Malik al-Tahir Ghiyas ad-Din ibn Salah ad-Din, who came to inspect the troops one day. He had the army records before him, and every time a soldier appeared in front of him, he asked his name and the scribe wrote it on the list. The employees of the military department recorded the names of those who had received fiefs according to their various levels, and the number of troops belonging to each fief holder in his fief. In front of each fief holder's name, there was a symbol referring to his fief without mentioning it clearly by name. Perhaps this was a precaution aimed at secrecy on the part of the department employees. Hence the department avoided mentioning the names of the fiefs and their yields, unless ordered to do so by the sultans. It seems that the military department spent wealth on the infrastructure and fortifications, in which Salah ad-Din took an interest, especially in Egypt, for fear of Crusader attacks against it, whilst he was in Syria. The best testimony to that may be the fortifications, on which he spent a huge amount of wealth, such as the Ayubid walls of Cairo and Qalat al-Jabal, which he built on the side of Jabal al-Muqattam. He also fortified the city of Damietta, which al-Makrizi said cost 1,000,000 dinars. The most important employees of the military department at the time of Salah ad-Din included the Nazir, who was regarded as primarily responsible for everything that happened in the department. Next to the Nazir came the Mutawalli ad-Diwan, whose job was to supervise the carrying out of the Nazir's instructions, and the Mustawfi, whose role was to follow up on the employees and ensure that they submitted the figures required from them on time, and there were other employees. The uniforms of the troops. When the Ayubid state succeeded the Fatimid state in Egypt, it differed from it in many of the ways in which the state was run. It changed most of its methods to follow the ways of the Atabeg state at the time of Imad ad-Din Zangi in Mosul, then of his son al-Malik al-Adil Nur ad-Din Mahmud in Syria. Their habit was to wear yellow woolen caps on their heads, with no turban wrapped around them, and with their hair in braids hanging below the caps. It was the same for Mamluks, Amirs, and others. In general, the attire of the troops in the Ayubid state was a natural extension of the attire of troops in the Zangid state. Food supplies. Food supplies were usually carried in the rear of the army and were called al-sikl, which means the load. But it so happened in some campaigns that they put the load in the middle of the army near the heart of the troops. The reason for that may have been their fear that the enemy might capture their supplies. In the middle of Jamadul Awwal, 584 Hijri, that is 1188 Common Era, the Sultan mobilized to meet the enemy and organized the battalions, putting the right flank first, the heart in the middle, and the left flank in the rear, led by Muzaffar ad-Din ibn Zain ad-Din, and the load traveled in the middle of the army. We find that the troops, for their part, carried some essential food supplies with them in sacks, called sulak, made of leather which hung from their shoulders. When preparing to set out, the troops would stock up by going to the market and buying the necessities, which might be no more than some bread, cheese, onions, and a little dried meat, and some grains, legumes, fruit, and dates. When preparing for the Battle of Ad-Ramlah, which ended in defeat for Salah ad-Din in 573 Hijri, that is 1177 Common Era, Al-Imad al-Khatib al-Isfahani reported. The call went out to the troops to take provisions for another 10 days, in order to be on the safe side. Orders were sent to the military market for the troops to buy at a time when prices had started to rise. During the campaigns that followed the Battle of Hattin, when the Ayubid army had started to raid the coast near the Crusader kingdom of Tripoli in 584 Hijri, that is 1188 Common of the lack of food supplies. So the Sultan arranged a huge ship for them and sent it to them. In order for it to reach Acre safely, he appointed in charge of the ship some former Christians from Beirut who had become Muslim, so that they could work out a deal with the enemy who were besieging the city, and trick them with their language and dress. To make the trick work better, he told them to raise crosses on the mast of the ship, and to put pigs on the deck. They sailed towards Acre, and on the way they were intercepted by the Crusaders, but they managed to make the trick succeed and convince them that they were fellow Crusaders, and so they were able to enter the besieged port, bringing supplies such as 400 containers of wheat, a quantity of cheese and onions, some sheep, and everything that was needed. Supplies were sent repeatedly to Acre because of the length of the siege. They came from Egypt, which was a land of plenty, in addition to what was sent from Beirut. The Muslims invented different ways to prevent the city falling into Crusader hands. But then they were defeated and Acre fell, and the difficulty of supplying the city was one of the main reasons for its fall. But some of the cities that were in Crusader hands fell to the Ayubid army because their food supplies were cut off. We find that the Ayubid army resorted at times of war to cutting off food supplies in order to starve the enemy, and thus weaken them and make them surrender. They also destroyed the Crusaders' crops and cut down their trees in the region of Kirak in an attempt to weaken its ruler, Reynald de Chatillon, and they harvested the enemy's produce so as to leave them with nothing. Military mobilization. Mobilization refers to a number of actions taken by the leader to gather the troops for battle and lead them to the fighting front or coordinate his commanders to respond to an enemy attack and defeat them. There is no difference in the concept of mobilization between ancient times and the modern era, but the means of mobilization, the troops, the equipment used and other factors are what changes. As for the system followed by the Ayubid army, it was a five-part system. The five-part system. We think that Salahuddin was not the inventor of this system, but that it existed before his time. He did not differ in principle from the leaders who came before him and who were known to have implemented this system. The Ayubid army was organized in the form of cadres similar to the main parts of a human body, or the shape of a cross. The trunk in the middle was like the heart of the army. The vanguard was in front like the head. The right and left flanks were like the arms on each side. Then the rear guard of the army were like the two legs together in the rear. Hence you can see that the format in this system was in five parts. The Sultan's place was usually in the heart of the army, and with him were his banners, so that all the commanders could see him and carry out his orders, to strengthen the army or reorganize it, if that was necessary for any reason. In some cases, he would move to the front to stir up the soldiers' zeal, and to instill fear in the hearts of the enemy. Salahuddin would put well-known leaders and commanders at the head of each flank. At the head of the vanguard, he put the scouts as well as cavalry, swordsmen, archers, and those who were able to move swiftly in single combat and in pursuit of the enemy. The inner circle and the Sultan's Mamluks. The Sultan's inner circle was composed of a number of troops who surrounded Salahuddin like bodyguards. This inner circle played a prominent role in various battles. They played a clear role in the conquest of the coast and Crusader strongholds. Ibn al-Athi referred to the conquest of the Citadel of Persia, the location of which was known to be rugged and well fortified, and described how Salahuddin divided his army into three parts, so that they could take turns to fight. When the turn of Salahuddin's elite forces came, they fought fiercely despite the intense heat. The inner circle also played a supervisory role during the siege of Acre, moving with Salahuddin when he moved between Tel Harubah, Shaf Amar, and Tel Kaisan, which were places surrounding Acre. This inner circle were the only ones who stayed with Salahuddin after the troops returned to their homes to rest when winter came in 588 Hijri, that is 1192 Common Era. Most of those in the inner circle were Egyptian troops. What confirms the importance of this inner circle is that they, and they alone, were in the heart of the Ayubid army, according to the report of Ibn Shaddad, who was one of the inner circle. It happened that the Sultan went to confront the enemy accompanied by no one but the inner circle. The men of the inner circle may have formed a Kropo battalion that was named after the Sultan, Al-Firqah as-Salahiyya or Al-Firqah an-Nasiriyya. The fighters who came under the direct command of a prominent commander would be named after him, because they were his Mamluks or slaves. So An-Nuriya were the Mamluks of Nuruddin Mahmud, and Al-Asadiyya were the Mamluks of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh. Abu Shama stated that included in the estate of Asad ad-Din Shirkuh in Egypt in 564 Hijri, that is 1168 Common Era, he left behind a number of slaves and 500 Mamluks, who formed the Asadiyya battalion. This means that the Ayubid army knew the Mamluk system. The Egyptian army at the time of the Mamluks was formed from the remnants of the Ayubid army, most of whom were Turkish Mamluks and some Kurds. The elite Mamluks of the Sultan were called the Inner Circle. The Ayubids followed the same methods as the Seljuks and their Atabegs, Imad-ad-Din Zangi, then his son Nuruddin, in having a lot of Turkish Mamluks and using them in the army, despite the fact that the Ayubids or the founders of the Ayubid dynasty were not Atabegs and were not the Mamluks of anyone, and no member of Banu Ayub was ever a slave. Battalions and types of army divisions based on the weapons carried by each division. The army of Salah ad-Din was based on the division of the army into groups like squadrons. At the head of every 200 or 100 or 70 horsemen, there was an Amir Muqaddam, the rank of commanded from other squadrons. This distinction was shown in the type of weapons and equipment used and the duties given to them. The army could not move successfully or engage in any military operations unless it was able to work in complete harmony and with full coordination, with all sectors helping one another when battle was joined. There were two basic types of squadron in the Ayubid army in addition to the auxiliaries. The cavalry. The cavalry, who formed the backbone of the army. Their main roles were fighting, scouting, and reconnaissance, because these roles required the swiftness of the movement that was essential for attacking, finding out, pursuing the enemy, and cutting off their retreat so that they could not get more supplies and food. Men who were sincere and chivalrous, with experience of war, were usually chosen for this duty, and they would avoid combat with the enemy in order to carry out reconnaissance. The aim of their operations was to estimate the enemy's strength and find out their weak points. In addition to that, the cavalry would lend support to places that were exposed to sudden danger. However, they were placed behind the infantry in battle order, as At-Tarsusi explains. Let the cavalry and superior warriors be behind the infantry, waiting to charge. Then when they want to charge, a way will be opened for them through which to charge, with the cooperation of the infantry. The characteristics that were required of the true knight were physical fitness and strength, and sound knowledge of how to confront the enemy, such as unarmed combat skills, how to use a spear and the art of archery. Horsemen were equipped with swords and long spears, and wore chain mail, shields, and helmets. As for their horses, it is possible that they put chain mail on them as well as their saddles. The infantry. The infantry, who formed the greater part of the army and bore the brunt of fighting and its hardships and consequences. The weapons carried by this group were light weapons, because they marched on foot. They used swords, bows, and short spears. It was the infantry who drove the enemy out of their trenches and finished them off. The most important duty of the infantry was protecting the army as it marched, so as to prevent it being ambushed by the enemy, and guarding the caravans, which carried supplies and equipment as they were being moved. In order of battle, the infantry were placed in the front lines, with the cavalry and superior fighters behind them. Other auxiliary squadrons. Other auxiliary squadrons were known by the names of the equipment that they used and the tasks they performed. So there were mangonel squadrons, testudo squadrons, naphtha thrower squadrons, intelligence gathering scouting squadrons, quartermaster squadrons, and so on. Before heading to the coast, Salah ad-Din inspected his army, positioning different battalions, filling in gaps and empty spaces, and making sure that the weapons carried by the fighters were in good condition. Just before setting out for Hattin on the day of inspection, the Sultan organized the troops and checked on them from afar and close up. He showed each commander his place and his position in the right flank or left flank, from which he should not move. He brought out the banners and the courageous archers in each division, and advised each division as to how it should cooperate with others. He said, "When we enter enemy territory, it is in this order that we should enter, and this is where the locations of our battalions and heroes should be." There was a person in the army whose mission was to call out, mobilize the troops to fight, and raise their morale. His place was close to Salahuddin. Every time a command was issued, he would convey it in a loud voice to the army. He was called Al-Jawish. He would call out to the people to get ready, or if necessary, he would call on a certain commander to move his troops to give help to such and such a group during the fight. If the enemy had penetrated the ranks, or he would stir up the fighters' zeal by shouting encouraging words such as Yalil Islam wa Asakir al Muwahidin, for the sake of Islam, O monotheist troops. End of part 1 of chapter 6. Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayubid State. Start of Part 2 of Chapter 6. Volunteers in the Ayubid Army. In addition to the regular fighters, both cavalry and infantry, who were registered in the department of the Ayubid Army, and the feudal troops belonging to the Ayubid emirs, and other emirs who came under the authority of Salahuddin one after another, who supplied the Ayubid army with fighters at times of need, and in addition to the Sultan's Mamluks, there were also individuals who volunteered to put themselves at the army's disposal, out of love for jihad for the sake of Allah, and a desire to liberate Muslim lands from Crusader occupation. In fact, the era of Islamic revival began to show clearly with the emergence of Mujahid Imad-ud-Din Zangi, the founder of the Zangid state, and at the time of his son Nuruddin Mahmud al-Shahid. This era reached its peak at the time of Salahuddin. His era brought to mind the days of volunteerism and jihad in the early days of Islam. It comes as no surprise to discover that the army of Salahuddin included a large number of volunteers, especially at the Battle of Hattin and the conquest of Jerusalem and subsequent battles, which has attracted the attention of historians. Ibn Kathir states that when the Sultan decided to conquer Jerusalem, scholars and righteous people came to him as volunteers. The volunteers came from various Muslim social backgrounds, tribesmen, villagers and city dwellers, poor and rich alike, especially scholars of jurisprudence and Sufis. Nuruddin Mahmud ordered that the call should go out to the warriors and mujahideen, and new volunteers including the young men of the cities and strangers, to make ready and prepare to confront the Franks, the polytheists, and heresy. The word volunteer was used to describe those groups who were not part of the regular forces. In the mosques, the sermon givers urged the people to volunteer for the Muslim army. No sooner had the sermon givers come down from the pulpits than the worshippers were shouting slogans and invocations, coming in groups and individually from all directions to the army camp. Salahuddin sometimes delegated to the volunteers the task of executing prisoners, especially heretics or crusader archers, as happened at Bait al-Ahzan in 575 Hijri, that is 1179 Common Era. Following the victory of Hattin, Salahuddin asked each one of the volunteers, including the Sufis, to execute one of the prisoners belonging to the two crusader groups, the Templars and Hospitallers. The volunteers had accomplished great things on the day of Hattin and contributed to the achievement of a swift victory against the Crusaders when they hastened to set fire to the dry grass that surrounded the Crusaders. The flames leapt high and the fire grew hot, and the wind was against the Crusaders, so it blew the heat and smoke towards them, and they were faced with a combination of thirst, hot seasonal weather, the heat and smoke of the fire, and the heat of battle, according to Ibn al-Athir. Auxiliary squadrons in the army. The Engineer Corps. The army was usually accompanied by an engineer corps and a medical corps. The former undertook missions which required specialized knowledge of the military engineering that was required for fighting, especially attacks on walls and ditches, such as setting up heavy war machines like the mangonel, testudo, heavy catapults, naphtha thrower, and so on. They also built camps and walls, especially in places that had a sensitive military advantage. Built and demolished bridges, filled in ditches, dug wells, decided where to lay siege to the walls of a city intended for conquest, and where to breach its walls, diverted the course of rivers, and did other engineering tasks which made up the duties of this corps. During the siege of Jerusalem, Salahuddin and his army kept circling the city for 5 days, and finally those who had knowledge of engineering found a suitable place in the northern side of the wall, near the twin-pillared gate and the church of Zion, and Salahuddin ordered that the siege engines be set up in that place. In 581 Hijri, that is 1185 Common Era, during the siege of Mosul, when the army of Salahuddin was unable to achieve a direct military victory against it, despite his many attempts because of the strength of its walls. Some of his men suggested depriving the city of water by diverting the flow of the Tigris. He put this idea to the scholar of jurisprudence, Fakhruddin ibn ad-Dahan al-Baghdadi, who was the best engineer of his era, who said, "This is possible and not impossible. It is easy and not difficult." In a letter sent by Salahuddin to the Abbasid Caliph, written by his consultant Al-Qadi al-Fazil, it says, "The engineers who have experienced said that it would be easy to divert the Tigris away from Mosul, and thus deprive that city of a source of water, at which point its people would be forced to hand it over without fighting, and without the harm that would be caused by intensifying the siege." Salahuddin did not put this idea into practice, however, and that was perhaps due to the fact that it was difficult and costly. He did not have much time, and he was interested in more important projects. The Medical Corps. The Medical Corps accompanied the army to the battlefield in order to treat the sick and wounded, which was necessary. The doctors and their aides formed what might be described as a mobile clinic, with everything that they needed of medicines, equipment, and stretchers to carry the wounded and sick. This equipment was carried on the backs of animals. They would set up in the camp a tent, where those who needed to could stay overnight. It seems that Salahuddin's era was one in which matters to do with medicine flourished, because there was a great need for that. Salahuddin and his emirs spent generously on them, In fact, Salahuddin started to take an interest in medical matters and encouraged those involved in them from early on in his career. He showed a great interest in the doctors who served the Fatimid court in Egypt and the court of the Atabeg Nuruddin in Syria, and paid a great deal of attention to them. One of the doctors who took part in the military expeditions carried out by the Ayubid Army was Abu Zakaria Amin al-Tawla, Yahya ibn Ismail al-Andalusi, one of the students of Al-Hakim Mu'tabaddin. He accompanied the army of Salahuddin in battle and then settled in Damascus, like many of the doctors of his era. It seems to us that the reason why they settled in this city was the presence of the great Nursery Hospital. Damascus was also chosen because of its proximity to the battlefields, so the wounded and sick could easily be sent there. Abu Zakaria was unable to work at the end of his life, but the Sultan allocated to him a military pension that he received until his death. Salahuddin did the same for other doctors, such as Ibn at-Tahan al-Baghdadi and the oculist Abul Fadl Sulaiman al-Masri. One of the most famous doctors of Salahuddin's corps was Muwaffaq-ad-Din Abu Nasrasad, who was known as Ibn al-Matran ad-Dimashqi. It is known that he participated in the Sultan's campaigns and worked in the Nursery Hospital. He wrote a number of medical books, including one titled The Nasiri Paper on the Preservation of Health, and many others. Al-Isfahani said concerning this doctor that he was brilliant and gentle, and was greatly praised for his sincerity. He, that is Abu Nasr, earned the appreciation of Salahuddin, who held him in high esteem. He was very knowledgeable, smart, and intuitive. The Sultan also had his own private physician, who accompanied him on campaigns because he sometimes suffered from pain and felt unwell, and pustules appeared on his back. His companions criticized him for not taking care of his health and not getting enough rest. His response to them was, "When I ride for jihad, the pain disappears until I dismount." His private physician not only treated the Sultan, he also treated his senior amirs and army commanders. When the ruler of Erbil, Zainuddin Yusuf Niyal-Tajin, fell sick with the fever that would lead to his death during the siege of Acre in 586 Hijri, that is 1190 Common Era, Salahuddin's doctor went to treat him. The Sultan himself would sometimes supervise the treatment of the wounded, as it happened after the Muslims' defeat at the Battle of Arsuk in Shaban in 587 Hijri, that is September 1191 Common Era, when he sat and watched as the wounded were brought in and treated. Military Music Corps. After the Jawish called out to the camp to get ready, the banners would be unfurled and the cymbals would start to clash. This was akin to military music or marches nowadays, and was part of what was done to stir up the zeal of the fighters. Historical events prove that military music played an important role in the Ayubid Army. A special place was allocated for it, which was called the Tabalkhana, which means place of drums. With regard to this, Al-Makrizi wrote that after Salahuddin settled in Egypt at the end of the Fatimid state, he organized the Tabalkhana. Al-Qalqashandi explained the meaning of this word, saying, "The meaning is house of drums, for it contains drums, flutes, and other instruments. These instruments were played at the time of fighting, and on other days 3 times a day. The one who beat the drum was called the bandar, and the one who played the flute was called munafir. The one who struck the copper cymbals against one another was called the kusi, from kusat, meaning cymbals." The custom was for the cymbals to be played when an important military personage arrived at the camp, whilst flags and banners were unfurled and flutes were also played. Every occasion had its own rhythm, which the musicians were taught to play and the fighters were trained to recognize. There was a special rhythm when circumstances dictating that fighting should not stop despite the defeat that had befallen them, so the cymbals kept playing and did not stop. There was a special rhythm that announced glad tidings of victory. When news came in Shawwal 587 Hijri, that is 1191 Common Era, that the Muslim fleet had captured Frankish ships that were carrying more than 500 crusaders, the Muslims rejoiced thereat. The victory rhythm was beat and the victory tune was played. Flag bearers. In the army, there was a group whose mission was to carry and protect the Sultan's banner. The flag or banner was the symbol which differentiated one group from another, and one state from another. Each Muslim and non-Muslim state had its own flag with a particular color. The color of Salah ad-Din's flag was yellow. In the middle there was the image of an eagle, as a symbol of strength and confidence of victory. Among the banners was a huge banner of yellow silk, called al-Isabah, on which were embroidered in gold the titles and names of the Sultan. A large banner called al-Jalish, at the top of which was a braid of hair, and a small yellow flag called as-Sanajik. The large banner was usually carried with the Sultan's entourage. Al-Imad al-Isfahani spoke of Salah ad-Din's banner when the Ayubid army conquered Sidon in 583 Hijri, 1187 Common Era. The envoys of its ruler brought its keys, and we ended its dark days, and the yellow banner appeared on its walls. Salah ad-Din's banner is also mentioned in a number of odes composed by the poets of that era, on various occasions when the Ayubid army achieved victory over the Crusaders and raised the Ayubid flag over them. When the Muslims defeated them and destroyed Bait al-Ahzan in 575 Hijri, that is 1179 Common Era, a group of poets offered their congratulations on this occasion, among whom was Baha'u'ddin Abul Hasan Ali as-Sa'ati al-Khurasani, who mentioned the yellow banner in his ode. Al-Alam ash-Shatani praised it in his ode too, which begins with the words, I see victory accompanying your yellow banner, so march and take over the whole world, for you deserve that. The flag was a symbol of sovereignty, and it was raised in places such as fortresses, ships, and major military installations. When one party was defeated, the first thing the victor did was to pull down the banner of the defeated party and raise his banner in its place, as the Muslims did in the fortresses they conquered, which had been in the hands of the Crusaders. As for the Crusader flag, it was described by Ibn Shaddad, who saw it being carried on a cart. He noted, the enemy's flag is raised on a cart to which it is fixed, and which is pulled by mules, and they fight to defend the flag. It is very high like a minaret, made of white cloth and painted with red in the shape of a cross. In other words, the Crusader flag was similar to the flag of the International Red Cross nowadays. Mail and Intelligence. Organization of the Mail. Organization of the mail system was done by a department that was set up for this purpose, which was called Diwan al-Barid and was supervised by state employees, whose job was to run the affairs of this institution. The Ayubid mail and intelligence systems were famous for always being superior to what the Crusaders had. During the Battle of Rimlah, which took place in 573 Hijri, that is 1177 Common Era in southern Palestine, and which ended in defeat for the Ayubid army, Subsequent events proved that Salah ad-Din had a very effective mail service. The way in which it was able to move quickly put an end to the rumors which were spreading in Egypt, which said that Salah ad-Din had been killed. The swiftness of the mail put an end to the ambitions of men who had started preparing to topple the Ayubid rulers in Egypt. That was when Salah ad-Din sent his envoys from the Egyptian border on dromedaries to Cairo to confirm to anyone who may be thinking of rebelling against him that he was still alive, and carrier pigeons were sent with the good news that he was on his way back to Cairo. In 578 Hijri, that is 1182 Common Era, when Salah ad-Din was in Egypt, he carried out a raid on Iraq and laid siege to it for 10 days. When he saw how low his army's provisions were, though, he ordered them to leave and go back to Egypt. The Ayubid historian Muhammad ibn Taqiyuddin Umar, who was with the Sultan's entourage, said, "Whilst we were marching, the mail carriers came to him with the good news of his uncle, Izzuddin Farah Shah's victory in the Battle of Taburia." Salah ad-Din's intelligence system was so accurate and swift that news of the enemy arrived continually, hour after hour, until morning, especially during the siege of Acre. His intelligence network included some of the crusaders to whom the Sultan had granted security on various occasions. The importance of these people was based on the fact that they knew the language of the enemy, and no one would think that they were Salah ad-Din's men because of their physical appearance. They supplied the Ayubid army with news of the enemy, which it would be difficult to get via his Muslim intelligence agents. On one occasion they told Salah ad-Din what the enemy was intending to do, which was to take the Muslim troops unawares at night. They told him about the huge Crusader mangonel on which they had spent 1,500 dinars and which had been prepared to launch an attack on Acre. They also supplied Salah ad-Din with news of the German campaign. During the siege of Acre, all means of communication with the besieged fighters were used in order to find out about the difficult situation and to send the money they needed. Contact was made with them by using carrier pigeons and swimmers. Perhaps one of the most famous stories of heroism in the Ayubid mail system is that of a swimmer named Giza. This man was able to enter Acre despite the naval blockade, bringing instructions from the Sultan in a letter which he tied around his middle, along with some money. Once he arrived in Acre, they would release a bird to inform the Sultan of his safe arrival. One night he went down to the sea and tied 3 bags to his waist, containing 1,000 dinars and letters to the troops. But he could not reach the city, and he drowned off the coast of Acre. They realized something bad had happened which had prevented the release of the bird. A few days later they found his body, with the pieces of gold and the wax seal of the letters around his middle. Ibn Shaddad commented, "Never before have we heard of a dead man delivering a message entrusted to his care during his lifetime, except this man." The Yazak Scout Corps. Yazak is a Farsi word referring to army scouts. The Yazak were a group of scouts who were sent out in the direction of the enemy ahead of the army. The mission of the Yazak fighters was part of the intelligence system to send information on the approaching army to the army commanders as quickly as possible. So we could say that the word Yazak referred to the system of daily dispatches sent by specialized individuals who were always on standby to go and find out at close hand what the enemy was doing or planning to do. The members of the Yazuk were chosen from among those who were sincere and courageous in war to undertake this duty. They avoided mixing with the enemy whenever possible, because the aim of their duties was to estimate the enemy's strength and find out their weak points. Hence they did not wear armor or carry shields or any other heavy equipment that might impede their progress. They chose horses that were calm, swift, of good temperament, sure-footed and strong, and were not easily spooked. In fact, contemporary historians, especially Ibn Shaddad and Al-Imad al-Isfahani, refer to the Yazak in their narratives and the many missions that they undertook, of which sending information was just one. Nothing is more indicative of the importance and critical nature of the Yazak's role at the time of Salah ad-Din than the fact that he appointed at its head senior military figures such as his brother Al-Malik al-Adil and his oldest son Al-Malik al-Afzal, as well as senior amirs such as Badruddin Daldaram al-Jaruki, Izzuddin ibn al-Muqaddim, Izzuddin Jurdik, Alamuddin Sulaiman ibn Jundur, and others. These amirs all led the Yazak in turn. Among the missions that were entrusted to the Yazak was the task of finding out the situation in cities, especially Jerusalem, when the Crusaders were threatening to reoccupy it after it was liberated in 583 Hijri, that is 1187 Common Era. All Salah ad-Din had to do was send his brother Al-Malik al-Adil at the head of the Yazak to find out about the city's defensive strength. Al-Adil set out for this purpose in Ramadan 587 Hijri, that is 1191 Common Era. Salah ad-Din did something similar when he sent the Amir Izzuddin Jurdik, Jamaluddin Farrakh, and others to march under the auspices of the Yazak to the vicinity of Jaffa, to find out the numbers of cavalry and infantry in the city. On some occasions the Yazak carried out ambushes, as happened on the way to Jaffa. This mission was entrusted to Badruddin Daldaram, who set up an ambush involving a good number of troops. Some enemy cavalry came by who were guarding a caravan bringing food supplies. Fighting took place between the two sides, in which the enemy lost. 30 were killed and a number were taken captive. The Yazak fought the Crusaders on numerous occasions. In one of their clashes, the Yazak almost captured King Richard the Lion-Hearted after he was stabbed, but one of the Crusaders managed to prevent his capture. Richard's compatriot offered himself in ransom for him, and distracted the soldier who had stabbed Richard with the fine clothes that he was wearing. So the hapless Yazak focused on this lower-ranking Crusader and captured him, and the accursed Richard escaped, leaving no trace. A number of his cavalry were killed or captured, and they fled from that encounter defeated and with their hearts filled with terror. Moreover, the Yazak protected the Ayubid army against the possibility of sudden attack by the Crusaders, as happened at Antioch. These multifaceted responsibilities that were delegated to the Yazak are indicative of their high status in the Ayubid army, which means that this military detachment included the elite and bravest of the Ayubid army. The size of the Yazak depended on the military mission being undertaken. Hence, as is to be expected, they included a large number of horsemen. Their number was as great as 1,000 on occasion, as in the case of the Yazak which Salah ad-Din appointed to keep watch on Acre, when he decided to move his forces to Jabal al-Kharuba. Thus we see that the Yazak developed as its missions developed, through the course of the ongoing bloody confrontations with the occupiers. It developed from a group which specialized in gathering information about the enemy, into an active military organization, which had certain aims of defending Ayubid army bases or Muslim cities, or launching sudden attacks on enemy camps and setting up ambushes. Pigeon Post. One of the main means of communication during the Ayubid era involved the use of carrier pigeons, which are also known as homing pigeons because of their remarkable ability to find their way back to their nests over vast distances. Al-Qadi al-Fadil described this bird in a delightful manner, calling it the angel of kings, because it descends from the sky to the kings as the angels descended from heaven to the prophets, alayhi salam ajma'in. It never fell short with regard to what was entrusted to it, and no act of betrayal on its part can ever be imagined. In addition to its ability to find its nest, this kind of pigeon was also famed for its swift flight. Even if it was caught and kept away from its homeland for 10 years or more, it still possessed strong mental ability, a good memory, and love for its homeland, and as soon as it had the opportunity, it would fly home. Hence the price of these pigeons was very high, as much as 700 dinars and even sometimes 1,000 dinars. The price of a single egg of this splendid type of bird could be as much as 20 dinars. There were organized stations for these carrier pigeons, which were the pigeon lofts for which keepers or guards were appointed to look after them, train them, feed them, ensure their comfort, release them and receive them. But when a pigeon landed with a message, the guard did not usually retrieve the message himself. Rather, he would take the bird to the Caliph or Sultan, lest there be some secret content in the letter which should not be seen by anyone else, even if the time was not suitable, such as if the Sultan was eating or sleeping. So he would leave his food or be woken from his sleep, so that there would be no delay in dealing with urgent and important matters. He would open the message himself, or the head guard would do this task. Nuruddin used carrier pigeons from the time he became governor of Aleppo and Syria, following the example of his father Imad-ad-Din Zangi. But in 567 Hijri, he organized the pigeon system on a new basis, paying more attention to how pigeons were taken care of and where they landed in various regions of his state. This system was inherited by the Ayubid state. The appointment of guards and protocols as to how messages were written and attached to the bird, how the pigeons were received, how the messages were opened and read. All of these matters were already in place when Salah ad-Din gained power. All he did was to increase the number of connections between Egypt and Syria by means of this air mail until there was a network of pigeon stations in Egypt and Syria that stretched from the southernmost part of Egypt, from Aswan to Cairo, then Suez and on to Bilbis, then from Bilbis to Syria, and from Bilbis also to Salihiyah and to Qatia. From Qatia it extended to Al-Warida on the way to Gaza, then to Gaza. In other words, Bilbis, which lies east of Cairo, was the center for pigeons landing in Egypt. Similarly, from Gaza on the coast of southern Palestine, a line extended to Hebron and to Lud, and from there to Qanun, and then to Jenin, Safad, Baisan, Irbid, Tafas, and then to Damin and Damascus, and from each of these centers to neighboring cities. From Baisan to Atrat, from Damascus, pigeons flew to Baalbek and also to Qara, and from Qara to Homs, and thence to Hama, then Al-Ma'rah, then Aleppo, then Beraa, and so on for the other cities of Syria and Mesopotamia. These stations undoubtedly contained a large number of pigeons. Later on, it was estimated that the number of birds in the pigeon loft of Cairo alone was approximately 2,000. The profession of raising pigeons became very profitable, as there was a high demand for the birds, especially during the Crusader siege of Acre. Al-Imad al-Khatib al-Isfahani wrote, "We began to heap a great deal of praise upon the one who raised these birds, buttering him up with special words of appreciation, asking him to give us more birds, night and day, until his stock ran low because we had asked him for so many. The Ayubid Army made use of the pigeon system established by Nuruddin. Salahuddin and his deputies used it at times of hardship. Carrier pigeons conveyed the good news from Palestine to Egypt that the Sultan was safe following the Battle of Ramlah in which the Ayubid army was defeated. Ali Mad said, "We sent the good news with pigeons. We sent letters with the words to put an end to all rumors and to spread reassurance after fear-mongering had broken out." The Ayubid army would carry with it pigeons belonging to various regions, with which it intended to make contact, or when there was a need to seek help from them, as happened in 574 Hijri, that is 1178 Common Era, when the Crusaders gathered and marched towards Damascus with their king, raiding and plundering the outskirts, killing and taking captives. Salahuddin sent word to his brother Izzuddin Farakh Shah, telling him to take a group of soldiers with him, and when he drew near to the Crusaders, to inform him of that on the wing of a bird, in other words, by carrier pigeon. So Farakh Shah marched with his troops to seek them out. Perhaps as a confirmation of how well organized the airmail system was during this period, the pigeons continued to reach Salahuddin from all over during his lengthy siege of Acre. Ibn Shaddad states that during Ramadan 586 Hijri, that is 1190 Common Era, pigeons were sent from Aleppo to Hama, and from Hama to Acre, carrying news from the deputies of Al-Malik al-Zahir, the ruler of Aleppo, that enemy forces from the Crusader Principality of Antioch were launching raids on villages belonging to Aleppo, taking advantage of the weakness of its forces, which was due to the fact that its troops had gone, led by Al-Malik al-Zahir, to Acre. But the remaining forces in Aleppo had managed to lay ambushes and defeat the aggressors, who were completely unaware until the swords were falling on them. 75 of their troops were killed and many were taken captive. The Muslims used all sorts of methods to conceal their secrets, so that the enemy would not find out about them, especially during the siege of Acre. They even used special symbols, or what we would call a code, to indicate things that had been previously agreed upon. Al-Imad stated that the male officials carried letters and birds, and they would go back with letters and birds. They would write to us and we would write to them on the wings of birds with a secret code. In these letters were written our secrets. Ambushes. There was more ambush activity during the Crusades, especially at the time of Salahuddin, than at any other period in Islamic history. This was because of the close proximity of the enemy and the ongoing friction between the Muslim forces and the Crusader strongholds that they established along the Syrian coast or close to it. The word ambush refers to the sending of small parties or expeditionary forces of fighters on horseback towards the enemy to take them by surprise and inflict casualties in limited clashes that do not lead to the level of all-out fighting. These operations were begun in secret, and so the men who fought in them had to have certain characteristics which would enable them to fulfill their mission in the required manner. It seems that after 585 Hijri, that is 1189 Common Era, Salahuddin decided that it was better to follow a policy of sending out ambush parties to harass the enemy forces and not leave them any room to relax. In the meantime, he was gathering his forces around Acre. So the Ayubid army now had to defend Acre on the one hand, whilst laying siege to the Crusaders, who were besieging Acre on the other, and also sent ambushes to harass groups of Crusaders here and there. We find that the circumstances in which the Ayubid army found itself during this period, and the suitability of the greater Syrian landscape, especially Palestine, with its foliage and mountains in which fighters could conceal themselves, made it essential for the army to organize these types of military actions, which were of limited effectiveness, but were aimed at disturbing the enemy and not letting them feel secure. This method of fighting is akin to that of guerrillas or special forces. End of part 2 of chapter 6. Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayubid State. Start of Part 3 of Chapter 6. Administrative matters in war and peace, and to do with captives. War cabinet in Salahuddin's army. It is natural that Salahuddin had helpers who aided him in managing the war, making military plans and administering the affairs of state. These helpers formed a committee, which was akin to what we would call a general staff, composed of Salahuddin, who usually chaired the meetings as it were, his brothers, especially Al-Malik al-Adil, his older sons, especially Al-Malik al-Afzal Ali and Malik al-Zahir Ghazi, his nephews such as Taqiyuddin Umar, his maternal uncle Shihabuddin Mahmud al-Harimi, senior amirs and commanders, his vice consultant Al-Qazi al-Fadil, the Qadi of the troops Bahauddin ibn Shaddad the historian, Bahauddin Karakush, Saifuddin al-Mashtub al-Hakari, other commanders such as Abul Hayja al-Hazabani, and Alamuddin Sulaiman ibn Jundur, the commander of the Egyptian fleet Husamuddin Lu'lu, rulers of well-known cities and citadels such as Muzaffaruddin Kokabri, Shamsuddin ibn al-Muqaddim, Izzuddin Jurdik and al-Faqih Diyad-Din Isa al-Hakari. Each of these men had the right to state his opinion openly and frankly, so long as it was based on the principle of service to the state and to the army of Salahuddin. The committee would meet whenever Salahuddin thought it necessary. We shall see below, insha'Allah, in the events discussed in this book, how Salahuddin consulted his companions on all occasions and with regard to all serious events, and he agreed with their views, sometimes willingly because he liked what they said, and sometimes unwillingly, but in the interests of protecting the Muslims' interests, making them happy and showing respect for the opinions of his commanders. Battle plans and fighting methods. The overall aim of the Ayubid army in fighting was to expel the occupying Crusaders, who had settled on the greater Syrian coast from Antioch in the north to Ascalon in the south, as well as some regions in the interior such as Jerusalem, Kirak, Edessa, Tiberias, and elsewhere. The strategic aim of their fighting was to regain land that had been occupied by the Crusaders since the end of the 5th century Hijri, that is 11th century Common Era. In order to achieve this aim, the Muslim army used different means and methods, whether in direct confrontations with the enemy or by weakening their economy and their morale by confining them to a few concentrated locations. The Muslims, especially at the time of Salahuddin, used different tactics to strike the Crusaders. Military plans in the Ayubid army were not drawn up by Salahuddin alone. He was helped by his consultative committee, even though central command was in the hands of Salahuddin. Success was usually guaranteed if the commander was able to receive ongoing information about the enemy. Otherwise, he might be subject to defeat if he lost his information. The Yazak played a basic role in that regard. It served as a constant source of information on enemy forces to the army leadership. Among the methods used by the Ayubid army and the operations that may be listed under the heading of tactical operations were the following. Cutting down trees. Among the actions that were aimed at weakening the enemy, he instructed his troops to cut down the grapevines of the farms of Safad in the Jordan Valley during the Battle of Bait al-Ahzan, which took place in 575 Hijri, that is 1179 Common Era, and he ordered that their produce be harvested. The aim behind that was to destroy the enemy's economy, so that they could not benefit from the grapes or the wood, or the grain that the troops had already harvested. This action was repeated on numerous occasions. The historian Muhammad ibn Taqiyuddin Umar al-Ayyubi stated, "The Sultan set out with those whom he selected from among his troops and headed towards Iraq at the beginning of 578 Hijri, that is 1182 Common Era, and reached it in a few days. There he found a large number of Franks. We camped close to them and harassed them and put pressure on them until they retreated to the wall. We captured them, cut down their trees and grazed our animals on their farmland. They did likewise when preparing for the decisive battle of Hattin, when they marched to the fortress of Kirak, intimidated its inhabitants, seized what was around it, grazed their animals on its farmland, and cut down its trees and grapevines. Then they marched to the fortress of Crac to Montreal, and did the same thing there." Cutting off water. The tactic of cutting off water had a profound effect on weakening and defeating the enemy. It is well known that the fact that the Ayubid army had control of the springs on the day of Hattin was one of the reasons for the enemy's defeat, as they were prevented from reaching the water, until thirst nearly killed them. The Ayubid army resorted to soiling the water of some of the springs of Jerusalem in 587 Hijri, that is 1191 Common Era, in an attempt to prevent the city from falling into Crusader hands after the defeat of the Muslims at Acre. Spoiling of the water was done by throwing arsenic or dead bodies into it. Methods of rapid warfare. Another of the plans that he followed was the application of methods of rapid warfare, taking the enemy by surprise and defeating him before he could gather his strength. This method is most clearly seen between the years 583 and 584 Hijri, that is 1187 and 1188 Common Era, when not content with the decisive victory at Hattin, he pursued further rapid victories to prevent the Crusaders from gathering in any one place and engaging in another all-out battle with him. Immediately after Hattin, the Ayubid army attacked one after another Acre, Saphoria, also known as Asafuria, Nasirah, Caesarea, Nablus, and Darum, and conquered them all. When they could not manage to conquer the city of Tyre because of its fortifications, he had no choice but to leave it alone. But he continued his conquests in other places, and he went on to conquer Jerusalem and other cities on the coast and in the interior. He conquered Hunan, Jablah, Latakia, and Mount Zion. Then he headed north and captured the fortress of Bagas, Shagar, Barziya, Darbasak, and Bagras, which surrounded the Crusader Principality of Antioch. Then a division of his army went south again, and at the end of 584 Hijri, that is 1188 Common Era, they captured the strong fortress of Kirag, which was called the Rock of the Desert. Finally, he conquered Safad and Kaukab, before drawing back to Damascus because of the onset of winter, so that he could get some rest. The plan to fight in turns. Salah ad-Din went to Tyre again, and at the walls of the city he implemented a plan which he had carried out successfully in his conquest of some other citadels, such as Barziya. This was the plan to fight alternately, which meant dividing his troops into 3 groups, each of which fought for a limited time. Then they rested so that the fight could be continued by a second group and then a third. By following this method, he aimed to exhaust the Crusaders and leave them no room to rest. However, this method was confronted with strongly fortified walls of Tyre, in addition to the city's topography. Driving a wedge into the Crusader ranks. Salah ad-Din followed a policy of driving a wedge into the Crusader ranks, creating trouble among them and befriending some of their leaders in an attempt to weaken them. Ibn Shaddad tells us that on one occasion in Shawwal 578 Hijri, that is 1191 Common Era, the Sultan summoned the ruler of Sidon to hear his message and listen to what he had to say. He came and brought a number of people with him, and the historian mentioned above was present. The Sultan honored his Crusader guests greatly and spoke to them, and he offered them food as was customary. When the food was cleared away, he sat alone with them and decided to offer a truce to the Marquis de Montfort, the ruler of Tyre, who was joined by a number of senior Franks, including the ruler of Sidon. Salah ad-Din stipulated that this dissenting marquis should show enmity towards the Franks, from whom he had split. The marquis was very afraid of them, and furthermore, he had disagreements with them that had something to do with marriage. The Sultan agreed to certain terms with the aim of causing division amongst them, according to Ibn Shaddad. Strengthening economic and commercial ties with the Italian city-states. Another of the wise procedures to which Salah ad-Din resorted in order to weaken the enemy economically was strengthening economic and commercial ties with the Italian city-states such as Pisa, Genoa, and Venice. From the time he came to power in Egypt, he did his utmost to attract trade from these cities to Egypt. He began to make arrangements with these city-states to exchange ambassadors with them. Salah ad-Din benefited from these agreements in 2 ways. 1. Increasing the income of his state by commercial activity. Thus he was able to get goods he needed, such as iron, timber, and wax. 2. Weakening the Crusaders' commerce, especially if we realize that Salah ad-Din dominated the Red Sea. No doubt this trade led to an interest in rebuilding the Ayubid Muslim fleet. In a letter addressed to the Abbasid Caliph in 571 Hijri, that is 1175 Common Era, Salah ad-Din wrote, "Among these armies are the Venetians, Pisans, and Genoans, who may sometimes come as fighters whose harm will be difficult to withstand, and the spark of whose evil will be difficult to extinguish, and sometimes they may come as ambassadors, complying with the rulings of Islam with regard to the goods they are trying to sell. But now all of them are bringing to our country weapons for fighting and jihad, and trying to show kindness to us by giving gifts of their finest work. I have established contact with all of them, and have made peace with them on the basis that we have got something extra that they dislike. and on the basis of what we prefer and they do not. These ties between Egypt and the Italian city-states were nothing new. Rather, they were a continuation of what had existed at the time of the Fatimids. Salah ad-Din succeeded in preserving and developing them. Destruction of cities. With regard to Salah ad-Din's war plans, it is worth mentioning that during his final conflict with the Crusaders who were led by Richard the Lion-Hearted, he resorted to destroying the city of Ascalon, which had been the southern key to Jerusalem and the route for caravans heading towards Egypt, and which the Muslims called the Bride of Syria because of its beauty. The Sultan resorted to this action when his army failed to defend the city, lest it be captured by the Crusaders when it was still intact, as had happened at Acre, and thus cut off the route to Egypt. Salah ad-Din decided to save his army's defensive strength to protect Jerusalem. He consulted his brother al-Malik al-Adil and his senior emirs concerning that, and they agreed with this idea. Alam ad-Din Suleiman ibn Jundur, one of his senior consultants, said, "This is Jaffa where the enemy has camped, and it is a city that lies between Ascalon and Jerusalem. There is no way to protect both cities, so go ahead and destroy its walls and citadel." Thus the decision was made to destroy Ascalon. In fact, this city was not the only one to suffer this fate. He decided to destroy the fortress of Ramlah too, as well as the fortress of Natrun, which belonged to the Templars. Part of the wall of Jaffa, Gaza, Lod and Darum on the southernmost coast of Greater Syria, which Salah ad-Din destroyed when he took control of the coast in 584 Hijri. This is what happened to the fortress of Sarmenia too, after al-Malik al-Zahir Ghazi captured it in Jamadi Sani, 584 Hijri, that is 1188 Common Era. He expelled its inhabitants before destroying it and leveling it, leaving no trace of it. He destroyed the fortress of Yazur on the coast of Ramlah in Palestine, and at the same time destroyed the town of Bad Jibrin, just before making a peace deal with Richard. Securing the route connecting Egypt and Syria. Another action that came under the heading of Salah ad-Din's strategic planning was securing the route connecting Egypt and Syria, the distance of which took approximately 30 days to travel. Salah ad-Din fortified the citadels and halting places, and set up guards along the route connecting Egypt and Syria, thus restoring security and peace to Sinai. Salah ad-Din and his commanders also used this route when coming and going to Syria. Fortifying cities and border posts. He took care to fortify the cities of Fustad and Cairo, and the borders and entry points into Egypt, the most important of which at the time of Salah ad-Din were Alexandria, Damietta, Rashid, Aitab, and Tis. Salah ad-Din understood the extent of the danger that could befall Egypt from the north at the hands of the Crusaders. What happened at Damietta when Amalric besieged it by land and sea in 565 Hijri, that is 1169 Common Era, made him pay a great deal of attention to that border city, and he was keen to fortify it. He also made sure to fortify the Red Sea coast. With regard to the Egyptian interior, the most important fortifications he built were in the city of Cairo. The Sultan began to build the walls of Cairo because most of them had been destroyed, and it had become impossible to prevent anyone from entering or leaving the city. He appointed Karakush al-Khadim in charge of that. The fighting season. Preparations for fighting began at the end of winter, when temperatures began to rise with the arrival of spring. During the winter, the two sides did not engage beyond a few brief clashes, setting up ambushes and sending out scouts to find out what the enemy was doing. If we look at the period of battles, we will see that they happened during a period of 8 or 9 months, starting when the period of intense cold ended and ending with the onset of winter. If we follow the log of Salah ad-Din's daily movements, which were recorded by al-Isfahani, Ibn Shaddad, and other contemporary and later historians, we will see that fighting and the arrival of armies from other provinces at the battlefield came to a halt in winter, but as soon as this cold and muddy season ended, especially in Syria, the army's activities resumed and preparations were begun anew to confront the enemy, and forces from the provinces arrived at the battle zone. After the fighting season ended, the troops would go back to their own lands. Al-Isfahani states that when the intensity of winter attacked and autumn came to an end, and the mountain peaks turned white with snow, and the ground turned muddy in the camp, the emirs asked Salah ad-Din for permission to go back to their own lands so that they could rest and recuperate. So the ruler of Sinjar departed, followed by the ruler of Jazira, Ibn Umar, and after him the son of the ruler of Mosul left. Ibn Shaddad states in that regard, under the heading, Return of the Troops from Jihad, that when winter attacked and the sea became wild, and we became certain that the enemy was not going to gather troops or march to besiege any Muslim city, because of the intensity and great frequency of rain, the Sultan gave permission to the Muslim troops to go back to their homelands, so that they and their horses could rest until the time for action came. On many occasions, the troops came to the battlefield to support the main Ayubid army after the winter ended. Then they went back to their homelands when that season came again. During the days of fighting, Salah ad-Din would be cheerful and optimistic if fighting occurred on a Friday, because of the status and sanctity of this day among Muslims. This does not mean that he refrained from fighting on other days of the week, waiting for Friday. Rather, he would be optimistic about the outcome of the fighting if it happened to occur on a Friday. During the Battle of Hattin, he sent his troops in the middle of the day on a Friday in Rabiul Sani in 583 Hijri, seeking blessing through the supplications of the sermon givers on the minbars, in the hope that this would be more likely to receive a response. The army of Salah ad-Din entered Acre on a Friday, during the conquest of the citadels on the northern Syrian coast, the citadels surrounding Antioch. It so happened that every conquest occurred on a Friday, which was a sign that the supplications of the Muslim sermon givers had been accepted, which brought joy to the Sultan, as he had been enabled to conquer them on the day on which reward for good deeds are multiplied. Perhaps Salah ad-Din's war council planned for fighting to happen on Fridays, which means that this day had a good effect on the Muslim fighters and motivated them to achieve heroic exploits in the fight. We do not think that victory and defeat have anything to do with a specific day. Rather, the effect of Friday with regard to Salah ad-Din's army was psychological. Victories occurred on the other days too, and indeed, his army also suffered some defeats on Fridays. Treatment of prisoners. Salah ad-Din was not inclined to shed blood and take revenge on Crusader captives, even though they had come as invaders and occupiers of Muslim land. Among the reports that have been narrated in this regard, we see that he prevented his sons from killing prisoners so that this desire to shed blood would not develop in them, because if they got used to killing their prisoners whilst they were young, they might do that without differentiating between Muslims and non-Muslims. Rather, he warned his son Al-Malik al-Zahid, when he was 20 years old, against shedding blood in the advice he gave to him during his final illness. In general, we find that the treatment of prisoners varied between putting them to work in forced labor, detaining them in Damascus, offering them for sale as slaves, and executing them. Perhaps it would be correct to say that Salah ad-Din did not differ from previous leaders or rulers in the way he treated prisoners, such as Nuruddin Mahmud, in whose footsteps Salah ad-Din followed in the way he ruled. He executed prisoners on some occasions, as happened in 552 Hijri, that is 1157 Common Era, when some prisoners were brought to him, and he ordered that they be beheaded. Similarly, Nuruddin Mahmud imprisoned them on most occasions, especially the senior leaders, as happened with Reynaud de Chatillon, the ruler of Antioch, then of Iraq, whom he detained for 15 years. Then the Amir Kumushtagin, one of the emirs of Nuruddin, let him go after the latter's death, so as to annoy Salah ad-Din. The aim of keeping prisoners alive, especially the rulers and princes among them, was to make use of them in exchanging them for Muslim prisoners. As it is well known that Nuruddin Mahmud was very keen to ransom Muslim prisoners, whether by exchanging prisoners or paying ransoms, especially the Maghribi prisoners, because they were strangers in Syria and had no family there. Among the things that Ibn Jubair mentioned in this regard was that among the kindness bestowed by Allah upon the Maghribi prisoners in Syria, kings and rich men would allocate some of their own money to ransom the Maghribi prisoners. Salah ad-Din was very keen to follow the example of Nuruddin Mahmud. Indeed, he often released poor Crusader prisoners for nothing in return, as happened when he conquered Jerusalem, in addition to ransoming Muslim prisoners. That was a must for him, as he was responsible for the lives of the fighters, and because by freeing them from captivity he was releasing a detained Islamic force. Hence this was a good deed and an act of piety. Some of his emirs also followed this practice. Among the reports about Muzaffar ad-Din Karkabari, the ruler of Irbil and son-in-law of Salah ad-Din, it is said that he sent messengers twice a year to the coast of Syria, carrying a great deal of money to free Muslim prisoners from the clutches of the Crusaders. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi said, "The wealth of his emirate has been used up in charity." This historian estimated the number of Muslim prisoners who were freed by this emir as 60,000, including both men and women. One of the events which highlighted the good treatment of prisoners is what happened in 587 Hijri, that is 1191 Common Era, when 45 Crusaders were brought to him from Beirut, among whom was a very old man who had no teeth left in his mouth. When he was brought before Salah ad-Din, he asked the interpreter to ask him the reason why he had come to the east when he was so old, among other questions. The elderly Crusader replied to the Sultan's questions, and the Sultan felt sorry for him and released him with no ransom, sending him back to the enemy camp on a horse. At the same time, Salah ad-Din imposed the severest punishments on some of the prisoners because they had committed the most heinous crimes that could not be forgiven, except by shedding their blood, and by exposing their crimes before starting to kill them, as will be explained below, insha'Allah. We find that Salah ad-Din thought it preferable to keep prisoners alive, so that he could make use of their labor in some projects. When he began to build the Citadel of Cairo, known as the Citadel of Salah ad-Din, he put these prisoners to work on this hard labor, cutting marble and huge rocks and digging the ditch that surrounded the fortress, which was dug from the rock with pickaxes, work which was so hard to do that there was no way, as Ibn Jubair says, to employ anyone in this construction except the non-Muslim, Frankish prisoners. A later Egyptian historian stated that Katakush employed 50,000 Crusader prisoners in the building of the citadel and the walls. Peace deals between Salahuddin and the Crusaders. The first peace deal between Salahuddin and the Crusaders occurred at the beginning of 571 Hijri, that is the summer of 1175 Common Era, when Salahuddin first settled in Syria. Undoubtedly, the pressure of political, economic, military, and other circumstances was what motivated him to make a truce with the Crusaders. In addition, he needed extra time to settle accounts with the Muslim groups who were opposed to him, as he was the leader who was supposed to lead the Islamic front against the Crusaders. Salahuddin also needed to block the way for the Muslim groups who wanted to cooperate with the Crusaders at his expense, especially the Atabegs of Mosul and Aleppo. All of these reasons motivated the Sultan and the Crusaders to stop the fighting and establish a period of peace between the two sides. When the truce had been concluded, the Sultan ordered the Egyptian troops to return to Egypt because there was no longer any need for them to be in Syria, in addition to the difficult economic situation in Syria, as we have noted. Similarly, Egypt was in need of its troops at harvest time. Al-Isfahani states that the Sultan gave the Egyptian troops permission to go back to Egypt and stay there for a while. In fact, Salahuddin did not make this truce or any other without still being cautious that the Crusaders might break it, as indeed happened. Neither did he lay down arms or feel content with a truce with the enemy occupiers. On the contrary, he kept his army in a state of continual preparedness, always watchful, and the fear of treachery did not stop him from engaging in skirmishes. Salahuddin also consulted his war council when he decided to make an agreement with the enemy to stop fighting. End of part 3 of chapter 6. Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayubid State. Start of Part 4 of Chapter 6. Weapons of the Ayubid Army. The ongoing state of war with the Crusader invaders which affected the region, particularly Greater Syria, led to the establishment of an active war industry, especially since this region had abundant supplies of some of the necessary raw materials, as well as many skilled artisans. Greater Syria was known for the wide availability of timber from the thick mountain forests, especially pine trees, various types of oak, beech, and other trees. However, the region was known for its scarcity of iron, but the rulers, especially Salahuddin, compensated for this shortfall by importing iron from Italy and elsewhere. Iron was found only in a few areas of Syria and Mosul, and it is most likely that this iron was still being mined at the time of the Crusades, whether by the Muslims or the Crusaders, when they occupied this area. In addition to that, the region of Mosul was rich in tar, and in the naphtha that was needed for the naphtha throwers. Mosul supplied Salahuddin from time to time with whatever its land and artisans could give. It sent him loads of white naphtha, shields and spears, yielding the best and finest of each type. Egypt was rich in various kinds of wood, which was used in shipbuilding. With regard to the kinds of goods used, they were as follows. 1. Individual or light weapons such as the sword, the dagger, the spear, the axe, the mace, the bow, and the slingshot. 2. Heavy weapons such as the naphtha and fire thrower, or weapons operated by a group such as the mangonel, the testudo, and the like. 3. Armor, like the head covering worn under the helmet, the iron helmet, the coat of mail, and the horse's coat of mail, were worn to protect the body. These items were worn by the knight or horseman, and he clothed his horse likewise, for protection against being burned by fire. And 4. There was also the mutallatat, which means triangles, a small tool made of iron or wood in the shape of a triangle, with sharp edges, and so on. The Ayubid Navy. Salahuddin's strategy changed after he moved from Syria to Egypt and found areas of weakness in the latter. He began to fortify its cities, build citadels, and organize the army to prevent the possibility of attacks against it. At that time, he focused on building up naval forces because he was aware of the strength of the Franks at sea and their weakness on land, and he realized that it was essential to build a war fleet to blockade the Frankish naval convoys, which were supplying the Crusader kingdoms on the Syrian coast with food, weapons, and men every time the pressure against them on land increased. At that time, Salahuddin discovered that the structure of the state in Egypt was weak and vulnerable, so he had no option but to reorganize its legislative and administrative affairs before starting to confront the Franks. Here it is essential to point out two matters that Salahuddin dealt with in addition to building a war fleet and fortifying the walls and the citadels. Firstly, Salahuddin realized the importance of keeping the trade and transportation routes between the Mediterranean and Red Sea open. And secondly, he recognized the difference between the interests of the merchants of the Mediterranean European cities and the ambitions of the rulers of the Latin kingdoms in Central and Northwestern Europe. So he signed trade agreements with them in return for their breaking their ties with the coast of Syria and Palestine. He also recognized the possibility that trade caravans might be exposed from the rear, as well as the possibility that the Hajj caravans might also be exposed to danger. Hence he ordered that his army be sent to Yemen to secure the sea lanes and put an end to pirate activity and attacks against the pilgrim caravans. Activities of the Ayubid Navy. The researcher may note that the Ayubid Navy went through three stages. The initial stage. In this stage, which we may call the preparatory stage, when the foundations were laid for the Ayubid fleet in Egypt, Salahuddin carried out a number of reforms. He reorganized the fleet, setting up for it a separate department under his brother's supervision, giving him the authority to take whatever raw materials he required, and to recruit the men he needed. Thus the new state acquired a fleet that was able, with support from the land forces, to defend the borders of Egypt, starting from 565 Hijri, that is 1168 or 1169 Common Era. The fleet continued to grow, and by 575 Hijri, that is 1179 Common Era, its numbers had multiplied to include 60 men of war and 20 lighter ships. The men of war in particular entered Byzantine territory and harassed the Frankish coast, capturing 1,000 non-Muslims and bringing them as captives in chains, and killing the senior officers. The stage of Ayubid naval strength in Egypt. This stage lasted from 1180 Common Era and ended at the beginning of 1183 Common Era, nearly 4 years. During this period, the Ayubid fleet managed to carry out a number of war operations against the Crusader fleet and to repel attacks launched by the enemy. Once the number of ships had increased and the resolve for jihad grew strong. The first war operation carried out by the Ayubid fleet was its confrontation with the enemy in a naval battle in 1180 Common Era, in which it achieved victory and managed to capture a large Crusader ship, with which they brought 1,000 prisoners. This naval victory was accompanied by the Ayubid Army's victory in the Battle of Bait al-Ahzan, so there was victory on both land and sea. It was no coincidence that the Ayubid forces achieved these two victories at the same time, because Salah ad-Din's victories started coming so swiftly that the Crusaders could not keep up with him, and he was not content only with defeating the enemy, destroying Bait al-Ahzan and raiding Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut, but he ordered the fleet to go out a second time from Egypt to attack Acre, the Constantinople of Syria, as Al-Qadi al-Fadil put it. They managed to capture numerous Crusader ships and started destroying, breaking, and scuttling them. This was something the like of which the Islamic fleet had never done before, not even when Islam was strong and disbelief was weak. Perhaps the greatest and most resonant victory was that which Salah ad-Din's fleet achieved in the Red Sea in Shaban 578 Hijri, that is the autumn of 1182 Common Era. The Crusader commander Reynaud de Chatillon took advantage of the fact that Salah ad-Din was preoccupied with the siege of Mosul and launched a huge venture that had several aims, including gaining control of the Red Sea, attempting to cut off the two holy sanctuaries, and trying to persuade the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia to take part in the Crusades. Reynaud attempted to gain control of the Red Sea by occupying Eilat on the Gulf of Aqaba and Aizab on the southern Egyptian coast, overlooking this sea. His targets included Jeddah and Rabil on the Arabian coast, from whence he planned on occupying Aden. Thus the waters of the sea would be at the mercy of the Crusaders, and in this way they would gain control of the trade routes. Then they would reach the waters of the Indian Ocean. Reynaud also planned to cut off the two holy sanctuaries, the heart of the Muslim world, from the rest of the Muslim lands, whether by land or by sea. This attempt was aimed as an act of provocation against all the Muslims, and at sending a wave of panic and fear among them. The Crusaders even resolved to enter Medina and take the body of the noble Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from his tomb. Reynaud de Chatillon hopes to persuade the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia to take part in the Crusades. Reynaud made preparations to carry out his naval venture. He ordered that the forests in the area under his control be cut down. He cut down the palm trees of Al-Arish, and he made ships from the wood, which he tested in the waters of the Dead Sea. He also asked the Crusaders of Ascalon to make more ships, until he had a fleet formed of 5 large ships and a large number of medium-sized and small ships. Then his men transported the ships in pieces to the coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, carried on the backs of hired camels belonging to the local Bedouin, after he tempted them with money. Reynaud sent a land army to Tabuk to block any military reinforcements that the ruler of Eilat might summon from Syria or Egypt. Reynaud de Chatillon traveled by sea and headed towards Eilat. It fell to him after a brief resistance. His forces were unable to occupy the citadel, Jazirat Firon, known as the island of Pharaoh, but they prevented its people from acquiring water, so they suffered intense hardship, according to Ibn al-Athir. The remaining ships of the fleet continued to raid the African coast, attacking everything that crossed their path until they reached Aidhab, where they captured merchant ships laden with goods that had come from Yemen and other areas such as India and Aden. The Muslims panicked when they saw the Crusader ships roaming the Red Sea, because it had never happened that they saw any Franks in that area, whether merchants or fighters. The Crusaders did terrible things, such as burning nearly 16 Muslim ships. They captured a ship carrying pilgrims and burned food supplies that were being sent to Mecca and Medina. This was in addition to killing and capturing people and other atrocities that they carried out on land and sea. From Aidhab, the Crusaders set out for the eastern shore of the Red Sea, that is the Hijaz, where they set fire to the ships anchored at Al-Hawra and Janbu, the two ports of Medina. Then they penetrated further south until they reached Rabil, one of the ports of Mecca, near which they sank a pilgrim ship that was heading towards Jeddah. This news reached Salahuddin in a letter that was sent by the man in charge of the Citadel of Eilat, who was staying in Mosul. The Sultan sent word to his brother and deputy in Egypt, Al-Malik al-Adil Abu Bakr, urging him to take the necessary steps to respond to the aggressors as soon as possible. It seems that Al-Malik al-Adil was already preparing for this mission before the request of his brother the Sultan reached him. He ordered the admiral of the fleet, Husam ad-Din Lu'lu, to get ready for a military campaign. Husam ad-Din constructed a fleet in the cities of Fustad and Alexandria, then dismantled the ships and carried them on camels to the coast of Gulf of Suez. The ship pieces were accompanied by Maghribi fighters, who then reassembled them. The Admiral Husam ad-Din Lu'lu divided the ships of his fleet into two groups. The first headed towards the citadel of Eilat and captured all the enemy ships, killing most of those on board, apart from a few who managed to escape and hide in the mountain passes and valleys. The admiral sent his men after them. They found them and finished them off like an eagle swooping down on its prey. As for the second group, he sent them towards Aidhab, but they did not find any of the enemy there. So they started to search for the enemy fleet and found one ship near Al-Hawra. They disembarked from their ships and started fighting them, pursuing any who fled. They captured 170 of them and freed the Muslim prisoners. Then they captured their ships and the goods on board. The admiral returned with his victorious fleet to Egypt, bringing the prisoners with their legs in irons. Their entry into Alexandria on 1st Zulhijjah, 578 Hijri, that is 1183 Common Era, was a great day that coincided with the arrival of the famous traveler Ibn Jubair to that city. He saw a crowd of people who had gathered to watch the Crusader prisoners being brought into the city riding on camels, facing backwards to the sounds of drums and flutes. Al-Malik al-Adil ordered that they be beheaded and that none of them be left alive, so that no one would be able to tell the route to that sea or any other information about it. Some Sufi men, scholars and prominent religious figures took on the task of executing them. As it says in the letter of Al-Qazi al-Fadil to the court of the Caliph in Baghdad, there was no question about these disbelievers being executed. There was no Sharia justification for keeping them alive, and no interest to be served by doing so. Let us be resolved to kill them so that no others like them would dare to do their deeds again. Their actions were so terrible. Islam had never seen the like before. It so happened that it was Hajj season, so the Muslims took some of the prisoners to Mina to slaughter them like the sacrificial animals. The success of Salahuddin's fleet in responding to the Crusader raid was a very bitter experience for the raiders, more than any other incident. It contributed to increasing the fame of Salahuddin and strengthening his position among Muslims. It also increased the fame of the admiral, Osam ad-Din Lu'lu. As for the leader of the Crusader campaign, Renaud de Chatillon, he managed to escape captivity and return to his fortress at Kirak, like a wounded wolf licking its wounds, to continue planning his aggression against the Muslims. But Salah ad-Din announced that he would never forgive him for his attempt to violate the two holy sanctuaries, and he vowed to take revenge on him himself. Neither this Crusader ruler nor any other Crusader leader was able to repeat this bitter experience in the Red Sea, which remained a Muslim sea. Perhaps the last action undertaken by Salah ad-Din's navy during this period was when it set out at the beginning of 579 Hijri, that is 1183 Common Era, and traveled far into the Mediterranean to look for Crusader ships. They found a large ship carrying 375 fighters and their weapons. It was heading towards the occupied Syrian coast, carrying wealth and weapons. The Muslims fought them and both sides stood firm for a while. Then the Muslims were victorious. They captured the remaining crew and took them and the booty back to Egypt. The stage after Hattin until the Treaty of Ramlah, from 583 to 588 Hijri. After the decisive victory of Hattin, Salah ad-Din's army continued to achieve victories on various fronts, conquering the border posts and fortresses in northern Syria, Palestine, and the Jordan Valley. But the activity of the fleet remained below the level required in military operations, and its role in helping to reduce the land army's heavy burden of fighting to conquer the coastal cities was limited. This was not the result of weakness on the part of the Ayubid navy, so much as the result of the strength of the Crusader navy. Salah ad-Din was aware of this difference and did not want his fleet to play a major role. In addition to that, he was worried about the attacks that the enemy might launch on the Egyptian coast if he sent all his naval forces to the Syrian coast. Hence we see that the land army did not conquer inland citadels and fortresses only, but it also conquered coastal cities such as Acre, Beirut, Ascalon, Latakia, and others. Nonetheless, this did not prevent his fleet from undertaking some missions to support his army. In Tyre, things grew very difficult for Salah ad-Din's army, as they were fighting on three fronts. The besieged city with its fortified walls, the northern front and the southern front surrounding the city. Thus the Crusaders found them an easy target for arrows from their ships, which were anchored on both sides of the place where the Muslims were fighting the people in the city. They shot at and wounded the Muslims from their port, and their arrows also reached from one side to the other because the place was so narrow. Many Muslims were killed or wounded, but they could not get near the city. Salah ad-Din soon sent for the Egyptian men of war anchored off the coast of the recently conquered city of Acre, and these ships arrived in the nick of time. The Muslims were able to get close to the walls of the city, and they fought on land and sea, putting pressure on the enemy, and it was expected that the city would fall after that. For these reasons, the mission that was given to the fleet was of particular importance. One of its tasks was to blockade the port and prevent any help reaching the Crusaders in Tyre by sea. Because of this, the fighters inside the city could not hold out for long. However, the Muslims grew a little careless in carrying out their mission of preventing Crusader ships from getting close to Tyre. Whilst 5 ships of the Ayubid navy were on guard to prevent the Crusaders from entering or leaving Tyre, they thought that everything was under control. The guards felt safe and went to sleep just before dawn, and the men of the Crusader navy took this opportunity to attack them. They killed whomever they wanted to kill, took the rest in their ships, and brought them into the port of Tyre, as the men of Salah ad-Din's army on land were watching. The commander of the Muslim fleet was Abdus Salam al-Maghribi, whom Ibn al-Athir described as proficient in his work and courageous, and Badran al-Farisi was with him. Some of the sailors who had been captured in their man of war whilst they were asleep managed to throw themselves into the sea, and some of them swam and were saved, but others drowned. As for the remaining 5 men of war, the Sultan asked their captains to head towards Beirut, because he could not benefit from their presence as they were too few, so they left, but the Crusader ship pursued them, and all the Muslim sailors and fighters on board threw themselves from the ships onto the land. Thus they saved themselves and abandoned their ships. Salah ad-Din did not allow these ships to fall into Crusader hands, however. He ordered a number of his men to go out and scupper them. Then he returned to fighting Tyre on land. As was to be expected, the Sultan was saddened by this disaster, and the disbelievers rejoiced at this strike. Thus the Ayubid fleet failed to take part in the battle for one of the coastal cities in Crusader hands. This operation was the only one undertaken by this fleet in this arena, and it was not repeated in the conquest of other cities. But it may be noted that the fleet resumed its activities during the lengthy Crusader siege of Acre to help the city withstand the siege and supply it with much-needed weapons, food, and fighters. The most important naval reforms of Salah ad-Din. In order to revive the navy in Egypt, Salah ad-Din undertook a number of reforms as follows. Requisitioning the forests of Egypt. The forests of Bassana, Safat, Ashmunin, Asyut, Akhmim, and Kous were especially sought after. The value of a single plank of wood was 100 dinars, according to Al-Makrizi. According to this edict, no one was allowed to deal in trees, so that their timber might be used. This edict remained in effect until the end of the Ayubid era in Egypt, despite the neglect of the navy. In this regard, Uthman Ibrahim an-Nabulsi, who was a contemporary of the Ayubid state in Egypt, mentioned that the forests came under the same ruling as metals, which was that they belonged to the treasury of the Islamic State, and no one had any right to ownership of them, with no exceptions. This law also applied to other necessary materials, which the state also imported from elsewhere, especially iron and timber, which were needed to build ships. The Ayubid state had connections and trade relations with the Italian republics, by means of which it acquired what it needed of these two raw materials. What confirms the application of this law concerning these materials is what was stated by the Egyptian historian mentioned above, An-Nabulsi, that all timber, iron, lead, and other types of material were brought to Egypt by sea, and they were sold to the naval department nearly at cost. The department bought them in order to build men of war and other kinds of ships, as well as for building construction and making stockpiles of weapons. In Alexandria, there was a department called the Sultan's Store, whose role was to buy imported goods needed by the state for military purposes, especially those needed for building ships. The men in charge of the store bought these goods with the assets from the war tax which was imposed on merchants. In addition to what we have mentioned in building his fleet, Salah ad-Din also made use of the pines and cedars that grew in the forests of Lebanon, and the iron which was mined in the mountains of Lebanon near Beirut. If this is true, then this happened after those regions were regained by the Muslims, after 583 Hijri, that is 1187 Common Era. Salah ad-Din establishes the Naval Department. In order to fund the Naval Department, He allocated for its expenses the land tax of Fayoum and its environs, and the land tax of Al-Bar al-Sharqi and Al-Bar al-Gharbi. Al-Bar al-Sharqi included the areas of Bahtin, Amiriya and Minya, and Al-Bar al-Gharbi included the areas of Safad, Nahya, and Wasim al-Basatin outside Cairo. He also allocated for this purpose the yield of Natrun, which at that time was estimated at 8,000 dinars per year, as well as whatever zakah funds were acquired in Egypt, which was more than 50,000 dinars, in addition to the fees collected from government boats. Raising living standards of sailors and workers. Salahuddin paid attention to raising the living standards of the sailors and shipyard workers and those involved in connected industries, so as to improve their situation and encourage people to join the navy and work in shipbuilding. It was decided that a dinar of the fleet would be equivalent to 3/4 of a dinar, after it had previously been 5/8. In other words, it was an increase of 17.5% on its previous value. Appointment of leaders for the fleet. Salahuddin appointed important military personnel to lead the fleet. Although the sources do not mention the names of those who worked in the administration of Ayubid naval affairs in the early years of Ayubid history, apart from the name of the prominent commander, Husam ad-Din Lu'lu, who was famous for repelling the attack of Reynal de Chatillon, as we have seen above, and the names of a few ship's captains such as Yaqub al-Halabi, Jamal ad-Din Muhammad ibn Arkakaz, Badran al-Farisi, Muhammad ibn Ishaq, Abdus Salam al-Maghribi, and others. The fact that Salahuddin appointed his brother al-Malik al-Adil head of the navy in later years definitively points to the extent of his concern for the naval department. When al-Malik al-Adil began his work, he appointed Safiuddin Abdullah ibn Ali ibn Shukr to be his deputy in supervising the administration of the fleet. Salahuddin granted the commander of the fleet far-reaching authority to carry out naval missions. After Salahuddin had finished preparing the fleet in 572 Hijri, that is 1176 Common Era, he wrote to all lands saying, "The one in charge of the fleet was full authority and should not be prevented from taking his men and whatever he needs." And he ordered the commander of the fleet not to leave the sea. Fortifying the borders. Salahuddin paid a great deal of attention to fortifying the borders. He decided to carry out large-scale operations at different times to maintain and refurbish towers and walls and dig ditches around them. He allocated large amounts of money to this mission and appointed men who were qualified to implement these plans, such as Bahauddin Karakush, to whom he entrusted the mission of renewing and building many military installations and other projects. Salahuddin visited to inspect and oversee fortifications and construction projects that were going on in the cities on the Mediterranean coast, especially at Alexandria and Damietta, and also Tanis. Following his return from his first journey to Syria, he set out in Shaban 572 Hijri, that is 1176 Common Era, with his two sons, Al-Malik al-Afzal Ali and Al-Malik al-Aziz Uthman, as well as Al-Isfahani, the well-known historian, and went via Damietta, where he saw how the work was progressing and saw precautions being taken. In 577 Hijri, that is 1181 Common Era, Salahuddin appointed troops to man the two towers that stood at either ends of the city facing the sea, and he ordered that the boats be chained together so that the defenders of the city might fight on them if the enemy managed to penetrate between the two towers. In the same year, he also ordered that the walls of Damietta be refurbished and the holes in them repaired. Later on, Salah-ad-Din ordered that the ditch of Damietta be dug and a bridge be built near the chain of the tower. Then he left Damietta and went to Alexandria, where, as the historian said, the Sultan refurbished the encircling wall. He did not leave before he had issued instructions that its border posts be completed and the fleet developed. This was the second inspection visit that he made to Alexandria. He made a third and final visit to Alexandria in 577 Hijri, that is 1181 Common Era, to see the walls that had been refurbished and the construction work that he had initiated, and ordered that it be completed. Among the fortifications that Salah-ad-Din ordered, built in Alexandria during this visit, was when he ordered Fakhr-ad-Din Karaja to break up 400 Roman columns which surrounded the lighthouse, and place them on the shoreline. This was possibly to prevent enemy boats from reaching the port, or to reduce the strength of the waves against the wall of Alexandria. Encouraging men to join the navy. Salah-ad-Din encouraged men to join the navy and brought in qualified elements from outside Egypt. His attempt succeeded because of the enticements offered to them by the Navy Department, or because of the spirit of jihad in the Muslims' hearts, which urged them to volunteer and work in the fleet, so that those who served in the fleet were called mujahideen fighting for the sake of Allah against the enemies of Allah, and people sought blessing from their supplications. Salah-ad-Din himself set a brilliant example of jihad. His historian Ibn Shaddad, who had seen a great deal of the terrors of the sea, said that Salah-ad-Din turned to him one day when they were talking and said to him, "I am thinking that if Allah enables me to conquer the rest of the coast, I will divide the land, give my last instructions and bid farewell. Then I will travel by sea to their islands, and pursue them there until there is no one left on the face of the earth who disbelieves in Allah, or I will die." The role of the Maghribis in the Muslim fleet. The Maghribis were the ones who responded most to Salah-ad-Din's call to work in the navy. They were the ones on whom he relied in preparing the Egyptian fleet, to such an extent that it became their exclusive preserve, according to Al-Makrizi, because they were well acquainted with the ways of the sea. It is known that the Maghribis became very famous in the East, especially in terms of naval jihad, because of their skill in piloting ships and navigation, and in the arts of naval warfare. Hence they were known as the Knights of the Sea from an early stage, and the Fatimids, Ayubids, Mamluks and Ottomans all sought their help in the administration of their fleets. The traveler Ibn Jubair states that the naval campaign led by Husam ad-Din Lu'lu against the Crusaders in the Red Sea at the time of Salah ad-Din involved a large number of Maghribi naval heroes. Perhaps the greatest evidence of the Maghribi specializing in naval affairs at that time is that Salah ad-Din sent his envoy Abdurrahman ibn Munqidh to the ruler of the Maghrib, Yaqub al-Mansur al-Muwahhidi, asking him for naval help to attack the Crusader posts in Syria. Despite the reports that al-Mansur refused Salah ad-Din's request because he did not address him in his letter as Amir al-Mu'minin, in other words, he did not acknowledge the al-Muwahhid Caliphate. The Maghribi historian As-Salawi al-Nasiri suggests that al-Mansur sent Salah ad-Din 180 warships to keep the Crusader ships away from the Syrian coast. Maghribi participation in the jihad against the Crusaders in Egypt and Syria took place on both land and sea. In this regard, We find a great deal of material in biographies and accounts of journeys which describe their actions and exploits, and mention the names of those who were martyred and buried there in Palestine. It is sufficient to refer in particular to the Andalusian traveler Ibn Jubair, who visited Egypt and Syria. This Maghribi traveler has given us valuable information about the activities of the Maghribi Mujahideen in the Crusades. For example, he refers to the additional tax that was imposed by the Crusaders in Syria only on Maghribi merchants and not on other Muslim merchants. The reason for that was because a number of Maghribi heroes fought alongside the Sultan Nuruddin Mahmud Zangi and captured one of the Crusader fortresses after a display of rare and exemplary courage. So the Franks punished them by imposing an additional tax of 1 dinar on every Maghribi merchant who passed through their colonies in Syria. This was in addition to the taxes paid by other Muslim merchants as a penalty for their courage. Ibn Jubair also speaks of the interest taken by Muslim kings, wealthy men and rich ladies in ransoming Maghribi prisoners because they were far from their homeland. This was in addition to the many endowments that were set up for Maghribis who settled in Syria. The Maghribis played a noble role in jihad. They were always in touch with their brothers in the East in both good times and bad, in the fields of knowledge and of jihad. They offered their fighting expertise to their Eastern brothers at the time of the Zangids and Ayubids, and they did not withhold their military capabilities from the Ayubids. They used them to confront the Crusader fleets. This shows us that the Muslim peoples were always interacting with one another and joining forces under the banner of Islamic jihad whenever the Ummah was exposed to danger. One of the important lessons we learn from this is that of the Muslims overcoming by means of their religion and beliefs the constraints of narrow-minded nationalism and tribalism. Nuruddin was a Turk, Salahuddin was a Kurd, Yusuf ibn Tashfin was a Berber, and the Abbasid Caliph was an Arab. But they all formed a united front under the banner of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Protecting the holy places against Crusader aggression was regarded as the most important task of the Ayubids during their rule. We could say that Salahuddin managed to form a land army and naval fleet that was equipped with everything that it needed for fighting in terms of weapons, equipment, and supplies, thanks to this wise policy that he followed in organizing his army, which spread the spirit of Islamic jihad in their hearts. He implemented a system of military fiefs in his state, through which it was possible to guarantee the availability of an organized army, which was supplied with everything it needed. This army played a part in achieving Muslim unity and paving the way for the jihad venture, which was aimed at eradicating the Crusader presence in Syria. There was no obstacle left to prevent Salahuddin from focusing on jihad against the Crusaders and taking back Jerusalem, except unifying the internal front. This is what we will find out about in the next chapter, Insha'Allah. End of part 4 of chapter 6. End of chapter 6.